2,400 years. That's how long we've been arguing about a story one Greek philosopher wrote down. Either Plato was the greatest liar in history or he knew something nobody else did. Tonight we follow the trail from ancient Athens to modern science labs. Here's what actually happened to Atlantis. Now, if you're settling in somewhere in the States or across the pond tonight, drop your city and time zone in the comments. And if ancient mysteries are your thing, that subscribe button's right there. Okay, so picture this. You're lying there, warm blankets pulled up, maybe the glow of your phone, the only light in the room. Outside, the world hums along with its cars and its sirens and its endless noise. You've got clean water whenever you want it, food in the kitchen, a roof that doesn't leak. Now hold that feeling for a second, because we're about to go somewhere very different. Athens, around 360 BC. There's an old man sitting in a garden. His name is Plato. He's about 70 years old now, which in ancient Greece basically makes him a medical miracle. Most people didn't make it past 50, but here he is. This broad-shouldered former wrestler with a name that literally means wide, sitting among the olive trees in the grove of the Academy. The Academy, that's the school he founded almost 30 years ago. Not a building, really, more like a park, a sacred grove northwest of the city walls, named after some hero called Academus, who nobody remembers anymore. There's a gymnasium there, some altars to various gods, and groups of young men who show up to argue about mathematics and justice and whether the soul is immortal. Plato's been running this place since he was about 40, and now in what he knows are his final years he's writing something strange, something about a lost island. But before we get to what he wrote, you need to understand who this guy actually was, because Plato wasn't just some random philosopher scribbling stories. He was complicated, he was political, and he was, if we're being honest, probably pretty bitter about how his life had turned out. See, Plato came from money, serious money. His family was basically Athenian aristocracy. His mother's side claimed descent from Solon, the legendary lawgiver we'll get back to in a minute. His father's side supposedly traced back to the god Poseidon himself. Take that with a grain of salt. Obviously, every rich Greek family claimed some god was their great-great-grandfather. But the point is, Plato was born into the kind of wealth and political connection that should have made him a major player in Athenian politics. It didn't work out that way. When Plato was young, Athens lost the Peloponnesian War badly. The city that had been the crown jewel of Greek civilization got absolutely demolished by Sparta, and in the chaos that followed, Plato's own relatives took power as part of a group called the 30 Tyrants. Now, the 30 Tyrants were exactly as fun as they sound. In about 8 months, they executed 1,500 Athenians without trial, confiscated property, sent people into exile, and 2 of Plato's family members were right in the middle of it. His uncle Charmides was one of the 30. His cousin Critias was their leader. Young Plato watched this happen. He watched his own family become monsters, and then he watched them get overthrown and killed when democracy came back. So, already Plato has complicated feelings about politics. Then Socrates dies. Socrates was Plato's teacher, his mentor, the guy who basically taught him how to think. And in 399 BC, when Plato was about 29, Athens put Socrates on trial for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods the city believes in, found him guilty, made him drink poison. Plato was there, or close to there. He mentions in one of his writings that he was sick and couldn't attend the actual execution. Some historians think he made that up because he couldn't bear to watch. Either way, the experience broke something in him. After Socrates died, Plato left Athens. He traveled for about 12 years, Egypt, Italy, Sicily. He met Pythagorean mathematicians in southern Italy. He studied with priests and philosophers and anyone who might have wisdom to share. And somewhere in those years he started developing his own ideas about how the world should work. When he came back to Athens around 387, BC, he founded the academy, started teaching, started writing, and for a while things were good. But then came Syracuse. Syracuse was this powerful Greek city on the island of Sicily. And 3 times in his life, Plato went there trying to turn theory into practice, trying to create his ideal state. The first time, around 388 BC, he met a young man named Dion, brother-in-law to the tyrant Dionysius II. Dion was interested in philosophy, became Plato's student, and when Dionysius Thor died in 367 BC, Dion convinced Plato to come back and tutor the new ruler, Dionysius II. The plan was beautiful. Train a young king in philosophy. Turn him into what Plato called a philosopher king. Create a state ruled by wisdom instead of ambition. It went wrong almost immediately. Dionysius II was jealous, paranoid. He exiled Dion, which made Plato's position impossible. Plato tried to mediate, failed, and finally went home to Athens, but he went back. In 361 BC, he tried again, and this time it got dangerous. Dionysius II basically held Plato prisoner for a while. The philosopher had to appeal to his friend Archaeology to intercede with the Syracuse government before he could escape. He was 67 years old, exhausted, and his great experiment had completely failed. Dion eventually went back to Syracuse, overthrew Dionysius, and ruled briefly before being assassinated in 354 BC by one of his own supporters. The whole thing ended in blood and chaos, exactly the opposite of what Plato had dreamed. So when we find Plato in 360 BC writing in his garden in Athens, this is the man we're dealing with, a philosopher who came from a family of thank you, rants, and watched them fall. A student who saw his teacher executed by democracy. An idealist who tried 3 times to build a perfect state and failed every time. He's got maybe 13 years left to live. He knows it. And he's writing about a lost civilization that was destroyed by the gods. You starting to see why this matters. The dialogues Plato wrote about Atlantis are called the Timaeus and the Critias. They're late works, probably written after his return from that last disastrous trip to Syracuse, and they're strange even by Plato's standards. See, most of Plato's writings are dialogues, conversations between Socrates and various other people debating philosophy, but Timaeus and Critias are different. They're less debate and more storytelling. And the story they tell is wild. It starts with a gathering. Socrates is there along with 3 other characters, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates. They're discussing what the ideal state might look like in action. Socrates has already described his perfect society in the Republic. Now he wants to see it tested. He wants a story about the ideal state going to war, and Critias says he has exactly that story. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Critias claims the story isn't fiction. He says it's actually true, an old account preserved in his family going back generations. The chain of transmission, according to Critias, goes like this. His great-grandfather, also named Critias, heard it from Solon. Solon was an Athenian lawgiver from about 200 years earlier, famous for creating many of Athens's foundational laws. And Solon heard it from Egyptian priests when he visited the city of Sai around 590 BC. So the story, supposedly, goes Egyptian priests to Solon, to the elder Critias, to Plato's character, Critias. And what did these Egyptian priests tell Solon? They told him that the Greeks knew nothing about real history, that their records only went back a few generations, that there had been many destructions of mankind over the millennia, many floods and fires and catastrophes, and the Greeks had forgotten them all. But Egypt remembered, because Egypt, according to these priests, had temple records going back thousands of years, written in hieroglyphics preserved across the ages. And in those records was an account of something that happened 9,000 years before Solon's time. 9,000 years. Let that sink in for a second. Solon visited Egypt around 590 BC. Add 9,000 years to that, and you're looking at roughly 9,600 BC. We're talking about the end of the last ice age, a time when sea levels were still rising from melted glaciers, a time before any civilization we have archaeological evidence for. And the priest told Solon that in this impossibly ancient era, there was an island, a great island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean itself. The island was called Atlantis, and it was, according to these temple records, the seat of a mighty empire. Now, your head hits the pillow a little deeper. The warmth of your blanket settles around you like something protective, and you have to wonder, what was Plato actually doing here? Was he recording a genuine tradition that Solon brought back from Egypt, some fragment of actual ancient history distorted through oral transmission, but based on something real, or was he making the whole thing up? 'Cause here's what's weird. Nobody else mentions Atlantis before Plato. We have tons of Greek writings from before his time. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote extensively about Egypt and its records. He never mentions Atlantis. Thucydides, the most rigorous historian of ancient Athens, never mentions it. None of the other philosophers mention it. Just Plato. And Plato, as we've established, had reasons to tell certain kinds of stories. He was trying to teach lessons about politics and morality. He used myths and allegories all the time. His famous allegory of the cave, the ring of Gages, the allegory of the allegory of the allegory. The guy loved good parable. So was Atlantis just another parable? His own student thought so. Aristotle, who studied at the academy for 20 years before starting his own school, apparently dismissed the Atlantis story entirely. According to later writers, Aristotle said something like, "He who invented it also destroyed it," meaning Plato made up the island and then conveniently sank it so nobody could check his homework. Pretty harsh coming from your own student. But here's the thing. Aristotle never explains why he thought Plato invented it, and other ancient writers weren't so sure. A philosopher named Crantor, who studied at the academy after Plato's death, supposedly went to Egypt and claimed he found evidence supporting the story. His work is lost, so we only know about this secondhand. But clearly there was debate from the very beginning, and maybe that's exactly what Plato wanted, because let's look at what purpose the Atlantis story serves in his dialogues. Plato has Critias tell this tale in response to Socrates asking for a story about the ideal state in action. And what does the story deliver? A perfect, virtuous Athens from 9,000 years ago, bravely defending the Mediterranean world against an aggressive imperialistic empire. The ancient Athenians in this story are everything Plato's Republic says a state should be. They're virtuous, they're well-ordered, they've got the right balance of classes doing their proper jobs, and they defeat this massive military power through courage and discipline. Meanwhile, Atlantis started out good. The early Atlanteans were wise and virtuous because they were descended from Poseidon himself. But over time, as the divine blood got diluted through marriages with mortals, they became corrupt. They got greedy. They built enormous palaces and harbors and war machines. They accumulated wealth and power until they forgot what actually mattered. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what Plato thought. Happened to Athens in his own time. The city that once defended Greece against Persian invasion had become an aggressive empire itself. It had grown wealthy, arrogant, overreaching, and it had paid for that arrogance with defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Atlantis was a mirror, not of some lost prehistoric civilization maybe, but of Athens itself, of what happens when a society forgets virtue and chases power. And when Zeus sees that Atlantis has become corrupt, he gathers the gods to pass judgment. That's where the Critias dialogue cuts off. Actually, right before Zeus speaks, the text is incomplete. We never get the final destruction. Some scholars think Plato died before finishing it. He passed away in 348 or 347 BC, and we know his final work, The Laws, was still being edited when he died. Maybe he never got to the spectacular ending. Or maybe he didn't need to. Maybe the message was already clear. Great civilizations fall when they lose their virtue. You can have all the wealth and military power in the world, and it means nothing if you've forgotten what actually matters. That's a lesson from a man who watched his own family become tyrants, who saw his teacher executed, who tried 3 times to build something better and failed every time. But here's where it gets complicated, because even if Plato invented Atlantis as an allegory, he put very specific details in there. Precise numbers, exact measurements, the kind of stuff that makes people think he was describing something real. And those details, they're bonkers. Next, we're going to actually walk through what Plato described. The concentric rings of water and land, the massive harbors, the walls covered in gleaming metal, the temple with a golden statue of Poseidon that reached to the ceiling. Because once you hear what this place supposedly looked like, you'll understand why people have been searching for it ever since. Your eyes might be getting a little heavier now. That's okay. Let them. We've got all night for this one, but let's pause for a second and really picture what Athens was like in 360 BC, because understanding where Plato was writing from matters as much as what he was writing about. The city itself was smaller than you might imagine. Maybe 250,000 people in all of Attica, the region around Athens. The Acropolis rose above everything, crowned by the Parthenon, which was already over 100 years old by Plato's time. Limestone dust from the quarries. The smell of olive oil everywhere, because olives were basically the Athenian economy. The agora, the central marketplace where philosophers and merchants and politicians all mixed together in the Mediterranean heat. Athens had central drainage, public fountains, temples everywhere. By ancient standards, it was a marvel. But it wasn't what it used to be. See, before the Peloponnesian War, Athens had been the center of the Greek world. The Dian League, which started as an alliance against Persia, had basically become an Athenian EMP. Ire. Tribute flowed in from subject cities. The Parthenon was built with that tribute money. So were the festivals, the fleet, the whole Golden Age. Then Sparta broke them. 27 years of war, plague that, killed maybe a quarter of the population, including Pericles, the great statesman. The disastrous Sicilian expedition in 415 BC, where Athens sent a massive invasion force to conquer Syracuse and lost almost everything. 40,000 men dead or enslaved, 200 ships destroyed. By 404 BC, Athens had surrendered. The great walls were torn down. The fleet was reduced to 12 ships. The Spartans installed the 30 tyrants. So when Plato writes about ancient Athens defending the Mediterranean against an aggressive naval power, he's writing about a version of his city that no longer exists, a golden age before the fall, before everything went wrong. And when he writes about Atlantis growing wealthy and corrupt and overreaching, he's writing about what Athens became in the years before its defeat. The parallel is almost too obvious. You can imagine him there in his garden, this old man who'd seen everything fall apart, his family destroyed by politics, his teacher murdered by the democracy, his attempts to build something better crushed in Syracuse, and he's writing a story about how great civilizations die, not from external enemies necessarily. The ancient Athenians beat Atlantis, but from internal rot, from losing track of what matters, from letting greed and ambition replace wisdom and virtue. Maybe that's the real message. Not that there was literally an island out in the Atlantic that sank beneath the waves, but that every society carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Heavy thoughts for a bedtime story. I know your breathing might be slowing down a little now, the weight of the day settling out of your muscles. That's fine. That's good, actually, because we're just getting started. Plato kept writing, and the story he told about that lost island, whether he invented it or not, would echo through the next 2,400 years of human history. It would inspire explorers and madmen, scientists and con artists. It would be used to justify colonialism and escape from reality. It would appear in movies and comic books and fever dreams. All because one old man sitting in a garden in Athens decided to tell a story about what happens when civilizations forget their purpose. The olive trees rustled overhead. The students argued in the distance about mathematics and justice. And somewhere in the back of Plato's mind, the walls of Atlantis began to rise. The golden walls, the silver temple, the statue of Poseidon driving his 6-winged horses toward the ceiling. We're going there next. For now, let your eyes rest if they want to. We've got time, all the time in the world, really. Atlantis isn't going anywhere. It already sank. So, what did Plato actually describe? Because here's the thing. If you're going to make up a fictional island, you can be vague about it. Say it was big and powerful and then move on. But Plato didn't do that. He gave numbers, measurements, specific architectural details, the kind of stuff that either means he had a source or he was showing off. Let's walk through it. The island itself, according to the Cretius dialogue, was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Now, in ancient Greek terms, Libya meant everything in North Africa, west of Egypt. Asia meant what we'd call Turkey and the Near East. So we're talking about a land mass bigger than Africa and Asia Minor put together. Absolutely. Massive, continent-sized, and it sat beyond the Pillars of Hercules. That's the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic Ocean. To the Greeks, that was basically the edge of the world. Ships didn't go much further. The Atlantic was this vast unknown sea full of monsters and mystery. So Plato's placing this empire out there beyond everything anyone knew, beyond verification. Convenient, maybe. Or maybe that's where the original story said it was. Now the capital city. This is where it gets wild. Picture a target. Those concentric rings you see at an archery range. That's basically what Atlantis looked like from above. Alternating rings of land and water with the royal palace sitting right in the center. The central island was about 50 stadia in diameter. A stadium was roughly 600 feet. So we're talking about an island maybe 5'1", over 2 meters across. On that island stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon. Around that central island, a ring of water, then a ring of land, then another ring of water, then another ring of land, then the outermost ring of water, which connected to the sea and served as the main harbor. Each ring of land was protected by walls. And here's where Plato starts throwing around materials that make you raise an eyebrow. The outer wall was covered in brass, polished brass catching the sunlight. The middle wall was coated in tin, gleaming silver white, and the innermost wall, the one protecting the royal compound, that was covered in orichalcum. Orichalcum. This word shows up in ancient texts here and there, but nobody really knows what it was. Plato describes it as a metal that sparkled like fire, second in value only to gold. Some historians think it was a gold-copper alloy, like a very pure form of bronze. Others think it was completely made up. Either way, picture those walls at sunset, brass, tin, and this mysterious fire-cold metal, all reflecting the light across the harbor. Ships coming in from the sea would see this blazing fortress rising from the water like something out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on your politics. The harbor itself could hold over 1,000 ships, merchant vessels, warships, everything. There were dockyards carved into the rock, covered roofs to protect the boats from weather. The whole thing was basically ancient military-industrial, complex but with better aesthetics. And those concentric rings of water, they weren't just decorative mows. Plato says there were tunnels connecting them, passages large enough for ships to sail through. You could navigate from the outer harbor all the way to the central island without ever leaving the water. Think about the engineering that would require tunnels through solid rock, water pressure management, the logistics of building something like that with Bronze Age technology. Impossible, probably. But Plato describes it like he's reading from blueprints. Now, let's talk about the temple. The temple of Poseidon sat at the heart of everything, 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, and tall enough to match. The exterior was covered entirely in silver, except for the pinnacles, which were plated in gold. Inside, a gold statue of Poseidon, driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses. The statue was so large it nearly touched the ceiling. Poseidon himself was surrounded by 100 Nereids riding dolphins, the whole scene in solid gold reaching up through the shadowy interior of this massive temple. Around the base of Poseidon's statue stood golden statues of the 10 original kings of Atlantis and their queens. A dynasty, frozen in precious metal, each king representing one of Poseidon's 10 sons, who divided the island between them at the beginning of Atlantean civilization. The temple grounds also contained hot and cold springs, baths for the kings, separate baths for commoners, gardens and groves, exercise facilities for men, and separate facilities for horses bikau. Apparently Atlantean horses needed their own gym. Actually, that detail is kind of funny. Plato specifically mentions that they had exercise areas for horses, not just stables, exercise areas like the Atlanteans were really into equine fitness. But here's where it stops being funny. The military. Plato gives exact numbers for Atlantean military strength, and they're staggering. 60,000 leaders of soldiers, 120,000 hoplites, that's heavy. Infantry, 180,000 archers, another 180,000. Slingers, 300,000 stone throwers and javelin men, 240,000 cavalry, 60,000 war chariots, and the navy, 1,200 ships, each one carrying 200 men. Add it all up, and you're looking at over 1 million soldiers supported by a civilian population that had to number in the tens of millions. To put that in perspective, the entire population of Athens in Plato's time was maybe 250,000. The entire Greek world might have had 3 million people. Plato's describing an army larger than most ancient civilizations. Where did all these people come from? How did you feed them, train them, equip them? Plato has an answer for that too. The agricultural system. The main plain of Atlantis was a rectangular stretch of land 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, roughly 340 meters by 230 meters, surrounded by mountains that sheltered it from northern winds. Across this plain, the Atlanteans built a canal system. The main canal was 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and over 0.000 meters long. It connected the capital city to the sea, cutting straight across the plain. From this main canal, smaller channels branched out in a grid pattern. They used these channels for irrigation and for transporting timber from the mountains to harvest per year, fed by winter rains and summer irrigation. The whole thing sounds like ancient California's Central Valley, but on a fantasy scale. Imagine standing at the edge of that plain, mountains at your back, snow-capped and forested. In front of you, flat farmland stretching to the horizon. Every few miles a canal cuts through the earth, blue water glinting in the sun, boats moving slowly through, those channels loaded with grain and timber. In the distance, smoke rises from forges and workshops. The sound of hammering carries on the wind, and if you look south toward the sea, you can just barely make out the gleam of the capital, those walls of bronze and tin and oracles shining like a beacon. The farmers out there probably didn't think much about philosophy or virtue. They were just living, growing crops, raising families, paying their taxes to the 10 kings, and hoping nobody started a war. Most people throughout history just wanted to survive and maybe have something left over for their kids. The big questions about gods and empires and the meaning of civilization, that was for the priests and kings to worry about. But the decisions those kings made affected everyone. And when the kings stopped being virtuous, everyone paid the price in the natural resources. Plato says Atlantis had everything. Forests full of timber, mines full of metals, including that mysterious oracle wild elephants roaming the countryside, every kind of fruit and vegetable, herbs and flowers for perfumes and medicines. The island was basically a self-sufficient superpower with unlimited resources. You're starting to see why this story captured people's imaginations. Because if you're lying in bed right now, and you close your eyes, you can almost see it. The golden walls catching the sunset, the ships filling the harbor, the smoke from the forges where they worked the oracle, the elephants moving through forests that don't exist anymore. It's vivid, specific, detailed in a way that makes you want to believe it. But here's the philosophical core that Plato cared about, the decline. See, the early Atlanteans weren't power-hungry conquerors. According to the story, they were virtuous, wise. They despised everything except excellence and saw their enormous wealth as kind of a burden rather than a blessing. Why? Because they were part god. Poseidon had founded their line by falling in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. He built that whole concentric ring system to protect her. Actually, the alternating bands of water and land were like a fortress of love, and their descendants, the kings of Atlantis, inherited some of that divine nature. As long as the divine blood was strong, the Atlanteans governed well. They treated each other fairly. They didn't obsess over gold and power. They maintained virtues that Plato valued: wisdom, courage, temperance, justice. The 10 kings would gather every 5th and 6th year, alternating in the Temple of Poseidon. They deliberate on matters affecting the whole island, judge disputes, renew their sacred oaths, and here's a detail that's kind of metal. Before they made any major decisions, they'd release bulls into the temple grounds. No weapons allowed. The kings would hunt these bulls with staves and noose, capture one and sacrifice it over a pillar inscribed with Poseidon's laws. Then they'd fill a bowl with wine, drop in a clot of the bull's blood, and each king would drink from it before swearing their oaths. Blood oaths by firelight in a golden temple. Plato could write a scene. The laws themselves were interesting. Inscribed on that pillar of orichalcum, passed down from Poseidon himself, the most important one. The kings could never make war on each other. They were bound together. These 10 royal houses, brothers descended from the same divine Father. If any king violated the laws, the other 9 were supposed to unite and punish him. But they couldn't kill a fellow king without the majority agreeing. It was basically an ancient UN Security Council, but with more blood and less bureaucracy. And for a long time, it worked. The Atlantean economy hummed along. Trade ships sailed in and out of that massive harbor, bringing goods from across the known world. The people lived well, not just the kings, but ordinary citizens. They had public baths. Remember, hot and cold, running water, entertainment, gardens, things that most people in the ancient world couldn't dream of. If you'd been born there during the good centuries, you probably would have thought you were living in paradise. Wake up with the Mediterranean sun coming through your window, walk down, streets paved with stone, buy food at the market without worrying about famine. Watch your kids learn to read and write in schools that actually existed. The basics of survival that people everywhere else struggled with. The Atlanteans had solved them. But that was the problem. When you solve survival, what do you do next? Some civilizations turn to art, philosophy, science. They start asking big questions because they finally have time to ask them. Others start looking outward, start wondering what else they can take, what else they can control. Atlantis chose door number 2. But here's the tragedy. Generation after generation, the divine blood got diluted. Atlantans kept marrying mortals, and with each generation they became a little more human, a little more fallible, a little more susceptible to the usual human weaknesses. Eventually they looked around at all their wealth and power and started to actually want it, started to see it as the point rather than a side effect. They got greedy, ambitious. They began expanding their empire, conquering territories in Europe and Africa. To anyone with eyes to see, Plato writes, they became ugly. The divine portion had faded out of them, leaving only mortal nature. But to themselves, they looked better than ever, more glorious, more powerful. That's a brutal line if you think about it. They became ugly, but couldn't see it themselves. And Zeus noticed. The king of the gods looked down at this great civilization rotting from within, and he gathered the other gods to pass judgment. He began to speak, and that's where the text ends. Mid-sentence, Zeus about to pronounce doom on Atlantis, and then nothing. The Critus dialogue just stops. Some scholars think Plato died before finishing, others think the ending got lost. A few think he intentionally left it incomplete because the audience already knew what was coming, because everyone knew. Atlantis sank. That's the whole point of the story. In a single day and night, earthquakes and floods swallowed the island. The greatest civilization the world had ever known vanished beneath the waves. The ocean where it once stood became impassable, choked with mud and debris, gone. And ancient Athens, the virtuous city that defeated Atlantis before the catastrophe, the perfect state that Socrates wanted to hear about, it got destroyed too. Not by the gods, by the same earthquakes and floods. The same cataclysm that sank Atlantis also wiped out the ancient Athenians. That's why there were no Greek records of the war. According to the story, everyone who remembered it died. Only Egypt, protected by the Nile, preserved the memory. So civilizations vanished. The corrupt and the virtuous, the conquerors and the defenders. Makes you wonder what Plato was really trying to say. Your eyelids might be getting heavier. That's okay. Let them close if they want. Picture the waters rising, the golden walls sliding beneath the surface, the temple of Poseidon filling with salt water as the statue of the god disappeared into darkness. All that wealth, all that power, all those armies and ships and elephants gone in a day and a night. And for 2,400 years, people have been trying to find it again. Some of them became heroes, some became laughingstocks, some went broke chasing shadows across the Atlantic, some made fortunes selling books about shadows. We're going to meet them all. The believers and the skeptics, the scholars and the crackpots, the scientists with their sonar equipment, and the mystics with their crystal balls. But first, we need to see what happened to Plato's story after he died. Because, for a long time, almost nobody cared. The greatest mystery of the ancient world. And people basically forgot about it for 1,500 years. How does something like that happen? We'll find out. But for now, let your body sink a little deeper into that mattress. Feel the weight of your blankets, the darkness behind your eyes. There's something peaceful about water. Actually, once you stop fighting it, once you let yourself go, the Atlanteans didn't have that peace. Probably the earthquakes would have started first, that terry, low rumbling. From below, cracks appearing in those perfect streets, the bronze and tin and oracle walls groaning as the earth shifted beneath them. Then the water, not slowly, not gently, a wall of ocean sweeping across that enormous plain with its grid of canals, those 1,000 ships in the harbor, tossed like toys, the temple of Poseidon ironically drowning under the waves of the god it was built to honor. How long did it take? A day and a night, Plato said. 24 hours to erase everything, every palace, every street, every elephant, every record of what they'd been and what they'd done, just gone. The survivors of ancient Athens, watching from across the Mediterranean, wouldn't have known what they were seeing. A distant storm, maybe strange waves, and then the Atlantean ship stopped coming. The trade routes went quiet, and eventually the earthquakes reached them too. Both civilizations snuffed out in the same catastrophe. And here's the really haunting part. According to Plato, the sea where Atlantis sank became impassable, choked with mud and debris. For centuries after, sailors couldn't cross it. That's why nobody found the ruins. That's why the Greeks forgot. That's why only Egypt, far up the Nile and protected from the sea, kept any memory of what had happened. Convenient explanation? Sure, but you have to admit it's complete. Plato thought of everything. Why there's no evidence, why nobody remembered, why the story had to come from Egypt instead of Greek sources. E.T. He was covering his tracks brilliantly, or he was telling a story he believed was true. We may never know which, but the people who came after him had opinions, strong ones. Atlantis is down there somewhere, in the deep water, in the mud and the silence. We've got all night to look for it. Plato died around 348 BC. They buried him in his garden at the Academy, the same grove of olive trees where he'd spent his final years writing about lost civilizations and ideal states. His nephew Spucus took over the school. The students kept arguing about mathematics and justice. Life went on, and for a while people talked about Atlantis. Not much, not everywhere. But in the philosophical circles around Athens, Plato's strange story got discussed, debated, picked apart. The biggest critic was someone who knew Plato better than almost anyone: Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had studied at the academy for 20 years, showed up when he was 17, stayed until Plato died. That's a long time to sit at someone's feet, learning their ideas, watching them write. By the time Plato passed, Aristotle probably knew his teacher's habits better than anyone alive, and Aristotle didn't buy it. According to later writers, Aristotle dismissed the Atlantis story with a kind of dry humor. He supposedly said something like, "He who invented it also destroyed it," meaning Plato made up the island and then conveniently sank it underwater where nobody could check. It's a good burn, honestly, the ancient equivalent of Pix. Or it didn't happen. But here's what's interesting. Aristotle never explained why he thought Plato invented it. He didn't write a detailed rebuttal, didn't point to inconsistencies or historical impossibilities. He just waved it off, which leaves us guessing. Did Aristotle know something we don't? Did Plato confide in him once, late at night in the academy gardens, that the whole thing was made up? Or was Aristotle just being his usual skeptical self, dismissing anything that smelled like mythology? We'll never know. Aristotle's comment survives only in fragments quoted by other writers centuries later. The context is gone, the tone is gone, all we have is that one cutting remark. But Aristotle's skepticism carried weight. He was, after all, Aristotle, the man who would tutor Alexander the Great, the founder of logic as we know it, the guy whose ideas dominated Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. When Aristotle said something was fake, people listened. Not everyone, though. There was a philosopher named Crant who took the opposite view. He studied at the academy after Plato's death under Xenocrates, and according to later sources, Crantor actually investigated the Atlantis story. He supposedly went to Egypt, talked to priests at seas, and claimed he found evidence supporting Plato's account columns inscribed with ancient records that matched what Plato described. Sounds exciting, right? Finally, some proof. Except Crant's work is lost, completely gone. We only know about his investigation because other writers mentioned it centuries afterward, and those writers were quoting from memory or quoting people who were quoting from memory. It's like a game of telephone stretching across 500 years. Did Ar really go to Egypt? Did he really find inscribed columns, or did someone make that up later to support their own beliefs about Atlantis? Nobody knows. The sources we'd need to check are buried under 2,000 years of history, lost in fires, floods, and the general chaos of empires rising and falling. The Library of Alexandria, which might have held Crant's original work, got burned multiple times across several centuries. Each fire took more irreplaceable texts with it. So we're stuck with rumors and fragments. And here's what's weird. After that initial flurry of debate in the decades following Plato's death, interest in Atlantis just kind of faded. Think about that for a second. You've got this incredible story about a lost civilization with golden temples and a million-man army, a civilization that supposedly ruled half the Mediterranean before being destroyed by the gods themselves. That should have been the ancient equivalent of a blockbuster movie franchise. But nobody wrote sequels. The great historians of antiquity barely mentioned it. Herodotus had died before Plato wrote the dialogues, so he couldn't have commented. But Thucydides, Xenophon, Polybius, Livy, all these major historians writing in the centuries after Plato, none of them devoted serious attention to Atlantis. Why not? Part of it was probably Aristotle's influence. If the most respected philosopher of the age said Plato made it up, that would have discouraged investigation. Why waste time chasing a fiction? Part of it might have been the story's structure. Remember, Plato's Atlantis narrative wasn't a standalone adventure tale. It was nested inside philosophical dialogues wrapped in layers of criteers, heard from his grandfather, who heard from Solon, who heard from Egyptian priests. That's a lot of steps between the reader and the action. If you wanted adventure stories, there were better options: the Iliad, the Odyssey, tales of Heracles. Nobody needed to dig through Plato's philosophy lectures to find exciting content, and part of it might have been what was happening in the real world. Because the centuries after Plato's death were not calm, Alexander the Great conquered everything from Greece to India, then died young and left his empire to tear itself apart. His generals carved up the known world like a birthday cake. Wars everywhere, new kingdoms rising and falling, entire cultures getting absorbed into the Hellenistic melting pot. Then Rome showed up. The Romans didn't have much use for Greek speculative philosophy. They were practical people, engineers and lawyers, and soldiers. When they encountered Greek culture, they borrowed what was useful, architecture and art and rhetoric, and left behind what wasn't. Plato's ideas about ideal states and the immortal, ity of the soul, those got picked up, heavily influenced later thinkers. Plato's story about a lost island beyond Gibraltar. Man, not very practical. There's a geographer named Strabo writing around the time of Augustus, maybe 50 years before Christ. He mentions Atlantis in his big geography book, and his tone is basically dismissive. He treats it as a literary invention, something Plato made up to make a philosophical point. Strabo was thorough. You have to give him that. The guy wrote 17 books covering every region. The Romans knew about Spain, Gaul, Britain, Egypt, India. He interviewed travelers, consulted older sources, tried to separate fact from legend. And when he got to Atlantis, he basically shrugged. The poet made it disappear, Strabo writes. Just as the poet made the wall of the Ans disappear, he's comparing Plato to Homer, both of them creating things with words and then conveniently erasing them. That's not a compliment, by the way. Strabo's saying both stories are fiction. The wall of the Aeons, if you're curious, appears in the Iliad. The Greeks build this massive fortification to protect their ships during the Trojan War. And then later, the gods destroy it completely, leaving no trace. Homer needed it for his story, and then Homer got rid of it. Strabo saying Plato did the same thing with Atlantis, created it to make a point, then sank it so nobody could check his work. But even Strabo admits there was disagreement. He mentions a philosopher named Posidonius, who apparently took Atlantis more seriously, thought maybe there was something to it. The passage is frustratingly vague, like someone summarizing a debate they half remember from a dinner party years ago. The point is, by Roman times, Atlantis had become a footnote, a curiosity, something philosophers might argue about over wine, but nothing anyone was organizing expeditions to find. And then Christianity came along. That changed everything. Not because Christians cared about Atlantis specifically. Most early Christian writers couldn't have cared less about some pagan legend from Plato. They had bigger concerns: establishing doctrine, surviving persecution, converting the Roman Empire. But Christianity brought a new way of understanding history. And that new understanding didn't leave much room for lost civilizations. See, the Bible has its own timeline. Creation happened according to calculations made from Scripture. Somewhere around 4000 BC, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, then the generations leading to Noah, the flood, and the repopulation of the earth afterward. That's a very specific framework, and it doesn't include a massive island empire existing 9,000 years before Solon. If you believe the Bible was literally true, which most Christians did, then Plato's dates were impossible. There simply wasn't enough time between creation and the flood for Atlantis to have existed, flourished, and been destroyed. Do the math. If the world was created around 4000 BC and Noah's flood happened maybe 1,000 years later, where do you fit a civilization that supposedly existed 9,000 years before Solon's time? That would put Atlantis around 9,600 BC, 5,000 years before creation even happened. The numbers don't work. Can't work unless you throw out either Plato or Genesis, and nobody was throwing out Genesis. Some Christian thinkers tried to harmonize the accounts. Maybe Plato got his numbers wrong. Maybe the Egyptian priests used a different calendar. Maybe the story had been garbled over time and Atlantis actually existed after the flood somehow. But these were minority opinions. For most people, the simpler explanation was that Plato made it up. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential Christian philosophers ever, barely mentioned Atlantis. He acknowledged Plato's ideas about the soul and the good, worked them into Christian theology, but the island story, not interested. When your main concern is salvation and the afterlife, ancient geographical mysteries don't seem very important. And then the Western Roman Empire fell. That's around 476 AD. The last emperor gets deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The machinery of Roman civilization starts grinding to a halt. Cities shrink, trade collapses, the complex networks that had kept books circulating, and scholars arguing begin to fray. We call it the Dark Ages, though historians hate that term now. Nothing was completely dark. Monasteries kept learning alive. The Byzantine Empire in the East continued for another 1,000 years. Islamic scholars would soon begin preserving and translating Greek texts. But in Western Europe, things got rough. Picture a monastery in Ireland, maybe the 7th century. Stone walls, cold rain outside, a monk hunched over a desk copying a manuscript by candlelight. His fingers are stiff. The ink keeps thickening in the cold. He's copying a text he barely understands in a language that's not his own because his abbot told him to. That's how knowledge survived, one cold monk at a time. The great libraries of Rome were gone. The public education system, such as it was, had collapsed with the empire. If you wanted to read Plato, you had to find a monastery that owned a copy, convince them to let you in, and hope the text hadn't rotted away or been scraped off for reuse. Books were expensive. Parchment came from animal skins. A single Bible might require the hides of 200 sheep. When writing material cost that much, you don't waste it on pagan legends about sunken islands. The kind of leisurely philosophical debate that Plato's Academy had enjoyed became a luxury nobody could afford. People were too busy surviving. Vikings raiding from the north, plagues sweeping through, populations, feudal lords fighting over scraps of land. And the books started disappearing. Not all at once, not deliberately, usually. Just the slow erosion of time. Manuscripts rotted in damp monasteries. Fires took out collections. Parchment got scraped clean and reused for new texts because fresh writing material was expensive. Plato's dialogues were lucky in some ways. They were important enough that copies kept getting made, but only certain dialogues. The Republic, the Symposium, works that seemed relevant to medieval Christian concerns. The TMUs, which contains the main Atlantis description, actually survived in partial Latin translation. A scholar named Chalcidius had translated about half of it in the 4th century. Monks copied his version throughout the Middle Ages. But here's the problem. Chalcidius's translation cuts off right before the detailed description of Atlantis. The medieval monks had access to the beginning of the story, the setup, but not the spectacular details, not the golden walls, not the concentric rings, not the army of 1,000,000 soldiers. They knew Plato mentioned a lost island, somewhere. They didn't know what it looked like. The Cretius dialogue, which contains all the juicy details, was essentially lost to Western Europe for 1,000 years. Imagine trying to understand Star Wars if you only had the first 10 minutes of A New Hope. You'd know something about farms and droids and a princess, but the Death Star, Darth Vader, the Force, all missing. That was medieval Europe's relationship with Atlantis. A fragment of a fragment, a vague reference to something that might have been important once. So for roughly 15 centuries, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, Atlantis slept, not completely forgotten. Byzantine scare. Haulas in Constantinople still had complete Greek texts. Islamic philosophers translating Greek works preserved references to Plato's story. Here and there someone would mention the lost island in passing. In Baghdad, during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars were translating everything they could get their hands on. Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Euclid. The House of Wisdom became maybe the greatest center of learning on earth. They had Plato's works. They knew about Atlantis. But the Arab scholars were more interested in Plato's metaphysics than his geography. The story of a lost island didn't fit their intellectual project. They were trying to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic theology, not hunt for sunken cities. And in Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors had other problems, defending the empire against Persians, Arabs, Turks, the slow centuries-long siege of a civilization, trying not to die. They preserved the old books, sure, but reading them for pleasure, that was for better times. So nobody was searching for it. Nobody was writing books about where it might have been. The great mystery of the ancient world had become background noise. Your eyes might be getting heavy now. The room probably feels softer, darker at the edges. That's okay. Atlantis was sleeping too, under the waves, under the centuries, under layers of history and forgetting, a story waiting for someone to remember it. And eventually, someone did. The Renaissance was coming. Scholars in Italy would start hunting down ancient manuscripts. Ships would begin sailing beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean itself. Explorers would find lands that nobody in Europe knew existed. And when they did, they'd remember that strange story from Plato, the island beyond Gibraltar, the mighty civilization that vanished. Was this it? Were these new lands the remnants of what was lost? The search was about to begin again. But for now, in the quiet centuries after Rome's fall, Atlantis rested. The golden temple filled with silt. The concentric rings collapsed into sediment. The orichalcum walls, if they ever existed, corroded in, the salt and the darkness. And above the water, generations lived and died, without knowing what might lie beneath. Some mysteries need time, need the world to catch up to them. Atlantis had plenty of time. So do you. Let your breathing slow. Let the darkness gather around the edges of your thoughts. We'll pick up the story when Europe woke up and started looking for lost things again. There's more. There's always more. But for now, just rest. Constantinople fell on a Tuesday, May 29, 1453. Ottoman cannons had been pounding the walls for weeks. The biggest of them, a monster built by a Hungarian engineer, could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton. Each shot took hours to prepare, but when it hit, sections of wall simply vanished. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V, could see how it would end. His city had survived sieges before, Arab sieges, Bulgarian sieges, even won by his own ancestors during the Fourth Crusade. But this time was different. The Ottomans had everything: numbers, artillery, a sultan who was young and ambitious and absolutely determined to take the city. Constantine died fighting in the streets. His body was never positively identified. Some legends say he was buried where he fell. Others say the Ottomans displayed his head. The truth got lost in the chaos, and with him died the last direct connection to ancient Rome. But here's the thing about endings. They're usually beginnings, too. As the city fell, scholars grabbed what they could and ran. Manuscripts, scrolls, books that had been sitting in Byzantine libraries for 1,000 years. They loaded them onto ships and headed west toward Italy, where rich merchants might pay good money for ancient wisdom. Among those manuscripts were complete copies of Plato's dialogues, the whole thing, not just the bits that medieval monks had preserved, not just the Republic and a chopped-up version of the TMUs. Everything, including the treatise with its detailed description of golden walls and concentric rings and orichalcum that sparkled like fire. For the first time in over a millennium, Western Europeans could read exactly what Plato had written about Atlantis. And this happened right when Europe was waking up. The Renaissance was in full swing. Italian cities were getting rich on trade. Bankers and merchants were spending money on art, architecture, and knowledge. There was this hunger for the classical world, for anything connected to Greece and Rome. Being educated meant knowing the old texts. Enter Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo was one of the richest men in Europe, ran the Medici Bank out of Florence, basically controlled the city without holding any official title, and he had a hobby that would change history. He collected books, not just any books, Greek manuscripts, the older and rarer the better. He hired agents to scour the Mediterranean for texts. When Byzantine refugees showed up with ancient scrolls, Cosimo bought them. He was building a library that would eventually become one of the greatest in the world, and in 1462, one of those Greek refugees brought him something special, a complete copy of the works of Plato. Cosimo was old by then, sick. He knew he didn't have long to live, but he wanted to read Plato before he died. Not in fragmented Latin, translations, in the original Greek or as close as he could get. Problem was, Cosimo's Greek wasn't great, so he hired a translator, a young scholar named Marsilio Ficino. Ficino was perfect for the job, brilliant linguist, deeply interested in philosophy, and absolutely devoted to the Medici family who were paying his bills. Cosimo set him up in a villa outside Florence and told him to translate everything. The Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo with its arguments for the immortality of the soul, the Laws with its blueprint for an ideal society. And yes, the Tus and the Crutiers with their strange tale of a lost civilization. Ficino didn't just translate. He added commentaries, explanations. He tried to show how Platonic philosophy could harmonize with Christianity, how the ancient wisdom of Greece pointed toward the same truths that Scripture revealed. This was his life's work, not just putting Greek words into Latin, but building a bridge between two worldviews, making Plato safe for Christian readers, making Christianity richer by connecting it to classical thought. The Atlantis story honestly wasn't his main concern. It was a small part of a much bigger project, but it was there in the complete translations, available to anyone who cared to look. Ficino worked for years through Cosimo's death in 1464, through the reign of Cosimo's son Piero into the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Cosimo's grandson who had become maybe the most famous Medici of all. By 1484, Ficino had finished his monumental translation of Plato's complete works into Latin, and there it was, the full story of Atlantis, available to anyone in Europe who could read Latin, which was basically anyone with an education. The timing was incredible because just 8 years later, in 1492, 3 small ships sailed west from Spain and found something nobody expected. Columbus wasn't looking for Atlantis. He thought he was finding a shortcut to Asia, the Indies, China, the Spice Islands. That was the plan. Sail west, hit Japan, get rich. Instead, he bumped into the Caribbean, and everything got very confusing very fast. Columbus went to his grave thinking he'd reached Asia. He called the natives Indians because he thought he was near India. But other people started wondering. The geography didn't match. The people didn't match. The plants and animals were all wrong. What had Columbus actually found? By the early 1500s, it was becoming clear that this wasn't Asia at all. This was something else entirely, a landmass nobody in Europe had known about. Whole civilizations living there, millions of people. And some of those people had built cities. When Hernán Cortés marched into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, his soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. A city built on islands in a lake, causeways connecting the islands to the mainland, massive pyramids, markets bigger than anything in Spain. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's soldiers, wrote about that first sight years later. He said it was like something out of a dream, or like the enchanted things they read about in a Marides, a popular romance novel of the time. The soldiers had expected savages, primitive people living in huts. That's what the Spanish had found in the Caribbean. But this was something else entirely. The great temple rose over 100 feet into the air, twin shrines at the top, one for the rain god, one for the war god. Blood still stained the steps from recent sacrifices. The whole structure was painted in bright colors, blue and red and white, visible from miles away. Around the temple, the city sprawled across the islands. Stone buildings everywhere, flat roofs where families gathered in the evenings, streets so clean that Diaz commented on it because European cities at the time were basically open sewers. The population was probably over 200,000. That made it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time, bigger than London, bigger than Paris, bigger than most European capitals, and it had canals. Canals everywhere because the whole city was built on water. You got around by boat as much as by foot. Thousands of canoes moved through the waterways every day carrying people and goods to the central market. The architecture was stone. The temples were covered in painted stucco. There was a zoo with animals from across the empire, a botanical garden with medicinal plants arranged by type. Aqueducts brought fresh water from springs on the mainland, because the lake water was too salty to drink. Two separate aqueducts, actually, so one could be cleaned while the other kept flowing. That's the kind of infrastructure planning that Rome had done 1,000 years earlier. And the market. Oh, the market. Diaz says 60,000 people visited the main market daily. 60,000. You could buy anything there. Cacao, beans, jaguar skins, live turkeys, obsidian blades, cloth of every color, pottery, jewelry, slaves. Each type of goods had its own section, organized, regulated, officials walking around to settle disputes and check the quality of merchandise. It was more orderly than any European market of the time. Sound familiar? Educated Spaniards who'd read. Their Fino started making connections. An advanced civilization on islands in the West, elaborate water systems, massive temples, wealth beyond European imagination. Could this be it? Could the Americas be what remained of Atlantis? Francisco López de Gomara published his General History of the Indies in 1552, and he said it straight out. Columbus, he wrote, had found the lands that Plato described. The New World was Atlantis, or what was left of it after the flood. Gomara wasn't some crackpot. He was Cortez's personal chaplain and secretary. He'd heard first-hand accounts of the conquest. He knew the details of Aztec civilization, and he looked at all of it and thought Plato was right. Not everyone agreed. Other scholars pointed out the problems. Plato said Atlantis sank completely. If the Americas were Atlantis, why were they still above water? Plato said the destruction happened 9,000 years before Solon. The Aztec civilization was only a few hundred years old. How did that timeline work? And Plato put Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. Sure, but he also said it was a single large island. The Americas were two entire continents, connected by a narrow strip. Not quite the same thing. Still, the idea caught on. Gonzalo Fernández de Ovo, another Spanish chronicler who actually lived in the Caribbean for decades, wrote extensively about possible connections between the New World and Plato's account. He noticed similarity, i.e. in construction techniques, similar agricultural methods, parallel myths about floods and destruction. He was doing what we'd now call comparative anthropology, though he didn't have that term. Looking at two cultures and asking, could they be related? The answer to his mind was yes. The indigenous Americans were descendants of Atlantean survivors. They'd fled the destruction, settled in these western lands, and slowly rebuilt civilization over thousands of years. It explained everything, why they had advanced cities, why they knew how to work metal, why their myths talked about ancient catastrophes and lost ancestors. The theory got a boost when Spaniards pushed further into the Americas and found more civilizations. The Maya in the jungles of what's now Guatemala and Mexico. They had pyramid temples too, elaborate calendar, systems, writing, cities now buried under centuries of forest growth, but once home to hundreds of thousands of people. The Inca down in South America, an empire stretching along the spine of the Andes, roads carved into mountainades, suspension bridges over gorges, terrace, farming that fed millions. No writing system, but they had queers, knotted strings that recorded information in ways we still don't fully understand. Everywhere the Spanish looked, they found complexity they hadn't expected. And each discovery fed the Atlantis speculation. 'Cause how else could you explain it? How did all these separate civilizations isolated from Europe and Asia develop so many advanced technologies on their own? The obvious answer, the one that modern archaeology supports, is that humans are smart. Give people 10,000 years in a fertile environment and they'll figure things out. Agriculture, architecture, astronomy, these things were invented independently in multiple places around the world. But that answer felt unsatisfying in the 1500s. It didn't fit the neat story Europeans wanted to tell about themselves and their place in the world. The Atlantis theory was more flattering. It suggested that American civilizations weren't actually independent achievements. They were echoes of something older, something connected to the classical world that Europeans saw themselves as inheriting. If the Aztecs were descended from Atlanteans and the Atlantans were cousins of the ancient Greeks, then Spanish conquest wasn't just theft and murder. It was a kind of family reunion, the civilized branch coming back to lift up the lost branch. You can see how that would appeal to conquistadors who needed to justify what they were doing. Except it didn't explain everything. The native American civilizations weren't actually that similar to what Plato described. The Aztecs didn't use the wheel. They didn't have iron. Their writing system was completely different from anything Mediterranean. The deeper you looked, the more the parallels fell apart. But people kept looking anyway because the alternative was harder to accept. If the Americans weren't connected to Atlantis, then who were they? Where did they come from? How did they get to this continent that supposedly didn't exist? Remember, Europeans in the 1500s thought they had the world pretty well figured out. The Bible told them how humanity spread after Noah's flood. Everyone descended from Noah's 3 sons. The races of man could be traced through those lineages, but the Bible didn't mention the Americas. So, either the Native Americans descended from one of Noah's sons and somehow crossed the ocean, or what? The Bible was incomplete. There were people God forgot to mention. That was a dangerous thought in an age when people got burned for heresy. Atlantis offered a convenient solution. A land bridge, basically a stepping stone that once connected the old world to the new. The Atlanteans could have been descendants of Noah, who settled on the island and later spread to the Americas before the whole thing sank. Problem solved. The Bible stays intact. The Americas make sense. Everyone can relax. Except scientists today know it's nonsense. The Americas were populated by people who walked across from Asia during the Ice Age when a land bridge connected Siberia to Alaska. That migration happened over 15,000 years ago, maybe longer. Nothing to do with Noah or Atlantis or any flood myth. But they didn't know that in 1552, they were working with limited information and trying to make sense of a world that had just doubled in size overnight. You can understand the appeal of Atlantis. It simplified things, made the strange familiar, turned a terrifying mystery into a solved puzzle. That's a very human impulse. When reality gets too weird, we reach for stories that smooth out the edges. Your blankets probably feel heavier now, the room settling into darkness. That's okay. The world got very big in the 1500s. It's natural to want to feel small and safe sometimes. While you rest, imagine those Spanish ships arriving in the Caribbean, the sailors seeing land after weeks of empty ocean, not knowing if they'd reach China or India or somewhere else entirely. They had no idea they were about to trigger centuries of debate, that some guy in a toga 2,300 years earlier had written a story that would suddenly seem relevant again. Plato couldn't have predicted the Americas. He didn't know they existed. Or did he? That question would haunt people for the next 500 years. Some of them would spend their fortunes trying to answer it. Some would spend their reputations. A few would spend their lives. But that's a story for later, when we meet the believers and the skeptics, the scientists and the dreamers, the one man who would do more to shape our modern idea of Atlantis than anyone since Plato himself. He was born in Philadelphia in 1831. He'd become a congressman, a farmer, a writer. He'd fail at almost everything he tried. And then he'd write a book that changed everything, but not yet. For now, just the slow rocking of ships, the endless blue Atlantic hiding its secor eats beneath the waves. Whatever's down there has been waiting a long time. It can wait a little longer, so can you rest now? Let the story drift like a ship at anchor. We're not done yet, not even close. For the next 2 centuries, people went a little nuts with Atlantis. Not in a bad way necessarily, more like enthusiastic. The Renaissance had cracked open the ancient texts. The age of exploration had revealed that the world was bigger and stranger than anyone imagined. And now scholars across Europe started asking, okay, but where exactly was this place? Because if Atlantis was real, it had to be somewhere, and finding it would be the discovery of the millennium. The Spanish had claimed it was in the Americas. That theory had legs for a while, but as Europeans learned more about Native American civilizations, the parallels started to break down. The Aztecs and Maya and Inca were impressive, sure, but they weren't quite right. The technology was different. The timeline was wrong. The geography didn't match. So people started looking elsewhere. And by elsewhere, I mean everywhere. Sweden, Morocco, the Sahara Desert, the North Sea, Ireland, Antarctica. Practically every corner of the globe got nominated at some point. If you had a pet theory about ancient history, you could probably find a way to connect it to Atlantis. The most ambitious of these early theorists was a Swedish polymath named Olaf Rudbeck. Rudbeck was not a simple man. He was a professor at Uppsala University, an anatomist who discovered the lymphatic system, an architect who designed buildings, a music who composed music, a botanist who created one of Europe's first botanical gardens, and in 1679 he published the first volume of a book that would consume the rest of his life. It was called Atland, and it argued that Sweden was the original Atlantis. I know, Sweden, the land of Vikings and IKEA. Not exactly where you'd expect to find a lost tropical paradise with elephants and year-round harvests. But Rudbeck had an answer for everything. See, Plato said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Everyone assumed that meant the Strait of Gibraltar, but Rudbeck said no. The Pillars of Hercules was just a Greek term for the edge of the known world. And to ancient peoples, the frozen north was definitely the edge of the known world. So Atlantis wasn't in the Atlantic Ocean. It was in the Baltic Sea. Specifically, it was Sweden. The concentric rings of land and water. Rudbeck found a spot near Uppsala where natural geological formations created roughly circular patterns. Close enough. The elephants, well, maybe Plato exaggerated. Or maybe there used to be elephants in Scandinavia, climate change and all that, the advanced civilization that ruled the Mediterranean. Rudbeck argued that the ancient Swedes had colonized Greece, Egypt, and everywhere else. The gods of classical mythology were actually Swedish kings, whose deeds got exaggerated over time. Odin was Atlas, though was Hercules. The whole Greek pantheon was basically Norse mythology with different names. He spent 4 volumes and over 2,500 pages making this argument. 4 volumes. The man was committed, and you have to admit he worked hard at it. Rudbeck didn't just make claims. He assembled evidence, linguistic comparisons, archaeological surveys, geographic analyses. He created elaborate charts showing how Swedish words connected to Greek and Hebrew roots. He mapped the topography around Uppsala and compared it to Plato's description of Atlantis's layout. Some of his methods were actually ahead of his time. He conducted what might be the first archaeological excavation in Swedish history, digging into ancient burial mounds to study their contents. He interviewed local peasants about old traditions and place names. He collected folk songs that might preserve ancient memories. The problem wasn't his work ethic, it was his conclusions. Rudbeck started with the answer he wanted and worked backward to find evidence. Every ambiguous fact became proof of his theory. Every gap in the record became space for speculation. And the sheer volume of material he assembled made it hard to argue with him, because who had time to check all those sources? It's a trap that still catches people today. Pile enough dubious evidence together, and it starts to look solid just from sheer mass. And here's the weird thing. In Sweden, people loved it. Rudbeck became a national hero. His book fed Swedish pride at a time when Sweden was a major European power. The Swedish Empire controlled chunks of Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. Why shouldn't they also be the heirs of Atlantis? King Charles II endorsed the work. The Swedish establishment ate it up. For a generation or two, Swedish school children learned that their ancestors had founded Western civilization. Outside Sweden, the reaction was more skeptical. Other scholars pointed out the obvious problems, the linguistic connections Rudbeck drew were creative but not convincing. You can make any two languages seem related if you cherry-pick enough words. The archaeological evidence didn't support such an advanced, ancient Swedish civilization. And honestly, the whole thing smelled like nationalism dressed up as scholarship. But Rudbeck had set a template. Take Plato's account, find a real location that sort of matches some of the details, explain away the parts that don't fit, declare victory. It's a template people are still using today. Meanwhile, in France, a different approach was developing. The Enlightenment was in full swing by the 1700s. Voltaire and his crowd were questioning everything. Traditional authorities, religious dogma, received wisdom of all kinds. If you couldn't prove something with reason and evidence, it was probably nonsense. And Atlantis, to most Enlightenment thinkers, it was obviously nonsense. Voltaire himself took a few swipes at Atlantis believers. He compared the search for the lost island to the search for El Dorado or the Fountain of Youth. Fun stories, but nothing more. Plato had invented a parable about the corruption of power, and gullible people had been taking it literally ever since. In his philosophical dictionary, Voltaire pointed out something important. If Atlantis had really existed, if a civilization that powerful had really traded with Egypt and Greece and everyone else, there should be other evidence, other texts, other traditions, artifacts, something. But there was only Plato, one guy, writing what was obviously a philosophical dialogue, not a history book. The Scottish philosopher David Hume developed ideas about evidence and testimony that would be devastating to Atlantis claims. Hume argued that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the more miraculous or improbable something sounds, the more skeptical you should be. Think about it from Hume's perspective. Which is more likely, that a massive island civilization really existed, sank in a single day, and left absolutely no archaeological trace, or that a philosopher made up a story to illustrate his ideas about politics and morality? The second option requires less violation of how the world normally works. A continent-sized island that sank in a day, ruled by the descendants of a god, destroyed 9,000 years before recorded history. That's a lot of extraordinary. And the evidence was one dialogue by one philosopher filtered through Egyptian priests who left no other records. N.O.T. Exactly a slam dunk. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant, when he bothered to mention Atlantis at all, treated it as a myth. Same with most serious scholars of the era. They had Aristotle's ancient dismissal. They had the complete absence of corroborating evidence. They had the obvious allegorical structure of Plato's narrative, case closed as far as they were concerned. But here's the thing about skepticism. It's not very exciting. Telling people that Atlantis was probably just a story doesn't sell books. It doesn't make you famous. It doesn't give nations a glorious mythical origin or explorers a magnificent quest. So, even as the Enlightenment promoted rational inquiry, Atlantis speculation continued. It just got weirder. A French scholar named Philippe Boichet proposed in 1737 that Atlantis had been located on a massive plateau in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He'd been studying ocean depth measurements, and he noticed that the Atlantic wasn't uniformly deep. There were shallower areas, ridges, places where the seafloor rose closer to the surface. What if those shallow areas used to be above water? What if Atlantis had been a real landmass that geological processes slowly submerged? This was actually a semi-reasonable hypothesis for its time. Boichet didn't have accurate seafloor maps. Nobody would for another 200 years. He was working with scattered depth soundings, from sailing ships trying to piece together a picture of what the ocean bottom looked like, and his general eye instinct wasn't wrong. There is a massive underwater mountain range running down the middle of the Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It's one of the largest geological features on Earth. But it wasn't a sunken continent, it was the opposite. The ridge is where new seafloor is being created as tectonic plates pull apart. The Atlantic Ocean is actually getting wider, not filling in. The ridge has been underwater for millions of years, long before anything resembling human civilization existed. Couldn't have known that plate tectonics wouldn't be understood until the 1960s. He was making educated guesses with the tools available to him, and his guesses were better than a lot of what came later. As the 1700s rolled into the 1800s, Atlantis theories multiplied like rabbits. The Romantic movement had brought a new fascination with the ancient and mysterious. Archaeology was becoming a real discipline, unearthing wonders in Egypt and Greece and Mesopotamia. Every new discovery seemed to prove that the ancient world was more advanced than anyone had thought. Maybe, just maybe, there had been an even more ancient civilization, one that predated Egypt, one that had taught the Egyptians everything they knew, one that had been lost to history until now. It was a seductive idea, and it created a market. By the mid-1800s, you could find books arguing that Atlantis was in the Crimea, in Nigeria, and the Caucasus Mountains in Brazil. Each author had their own evidence, their own linguistic connections, their own reinterpretation of Plato's text. None of it was very rigorous. Most of it was forgotten within a generation, but it kept the idea alive, kept people talking, kept publishers printing. The stage was being set for someone to come along and synthesize it all, someone who could take all these scattered threads and weave them into a coherent narrative, someone with the skills of a politician and the vision of a prophet, someone who would turn Atlantis from a philosophical curiosity into a cultural phenomenon. He was born in Philadelphia in 1831. His name was Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, and nothing in his early life suggested he'd become the godfather of Atlantis mythology. His father was a doctor who died when Ignatius was young. His mother ran a pawn shop to keep the family afloat. Young Donnelly trained as a lawyer, passed the bar in Philadelphia, and by his mid-20s had already developed a reputation for ambition, also for bad luck. In 1856, Donnelly moved to Minnesota with a partner to found a utopian community. They called it Ninja City. The plan was to create a perfect little society on the frontier, sell lots to settlers, and get rich. Then the panic of 1857 hit. The economy crashed. Settlers stopped coming. Ninja City never grew beyond a few hundred residents. Donnelly was left holding property nobody wanted in a town that would never exist. Most people would have taken that as a lesson, cut their losses, tried something more practical. Donnelly ran for office. He won a seat as lieutenant governor of Minnesota in 1859. Then he got elected to Congress during the Civil War, served 3 terms in the House of Representatives, became known as a fiery speaker and a champion of progressive causes, supported homestead rights, fought against monopolies, argued for better treatment of Native Americans. He was good at politics, really good, the kind of speaker who could hold a crowd for hours and make them feel like they were part of something important. In Congress, Donnelly made a name for himself. He delivered speeches that got reprinted in newspapers. He championed causes that mattered to ordinary farmers and workers. He wasn't afraid to pick fights with railroads, with banks, with anyone who seemed to be squeezing the little guy. People called him the Sage of Neininger. Even though Neininger was still mostly empty lots and broken dreams, he wore the nickname proudly, saw himself as a truth-teller, an outsider who understood things the establishment didn't. But politics also broke his heart. He made enemies, lots of them. His sharp tongue and sharper pen created feuds that followed him for years. He accused a fellow congressman of corruption, got accused of corruption. Himself spent years fighting legal suits and countersuits that drained his money and his reputation. By 1870, his political career had stalled. He tried to get back to Congress multiple times, lost, tried to get appointed to federal positions, failed. The Republican RTY had moved on, without him. The Democrats didn't trust him. He was a man without a political home. So he tried other things. Started a newspaper. It folded. Tried farming. Seriously, the weather didn't cooperate. Tried third-party runs on various tickets. The Greenback Party, the Anti-Monopoly Party, the Farmers' Alliance, never quite connected, never quite broke through, and somewhere in all that failure, all those long winters on the Minnesota prairie with nothing to do but read and think, Donnelly started writing books. The first one was a scientific treatise arguing that the ice ages had been caused by a comet striking the Earth. It sold okay, got some reviews. Nothing spectacular, but Donnelly was learning how to structure an argument for a popular audience, learning how to take dense academic material and make it exciting, learning how to create the sense that he was revealing hidden truths that the establishment didn't want you to know. And in the winter of 1881, sitting in his farmhouse in Minnesota, surrounded by stacks of books and papers, he started writing about Atlantis. The man was 50 years old. He'd failed at real estate. He'd been pushed out of politics. His great ambitions had come to nothing. But he still knew how to tell a story, and he was about to tell the biggest one of his life. Your breathing has probably slowed by now. The room feels quieter than it did when we started. That's the night settling in around you. There's something peaceful about being on the edge of something. The moment before the story changes, Donnelly sitting at his desk in the lamplight, pages piling up, not knowing yet that he was creating a mythology that would outlast him by more than a century. We'll meet his book next, see what he actually wrote, understand why it hit like a bomb. But for now, just rest in that in-between moment. The darkness is comfortable. The story will still be here when you're ready. Atlantis waited 9,000 years for someone to remember it properly. You can wait a few more minutes. Donnie's book came out in 1882. The full title was Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. 500 pages crammed with evidence, maps, charts, linguistic, tables, citations from every ancient source Donnelly could get his hands on. It was not a casual read, but it hit like a bomb. Within a few years, the book had gone through dozens of printings. It was translated into multiple languages. Prime ministers and princes read it. Scientists and scholars argued about it. Regular people bought copies and stayed up late, convinced that Donnelly had cracked the greatest mystery of the ancient world. The book reached surprising audiences. William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Britain, read it and was fascinated. He wrote to Donnelly praising his research. The correspondence between a Minnesota farmer and the leader of the British Empire went on for months. Charles Darwin, near the end of his life, received a copy. It's not clear if he read it, but the fact that Donnelly had the audacity to send it shows something about the man's confidence. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reviewed it. Most reviews were positive, or at least interested. The skeptical voices were there, but they were outnumbered by the enthusiastic ones. In an age before television or radio, before movies or the internet, books were entertainment, and Donnelly had written one hell of an entertaining book. Dense with facts, yes, but readable, dramatic, full of the sense that you were being let in on something big. What made it so powerful? Partly it was timing. The 1880s were a golden age for popular science. Archaeology was uncovering wonders in Egypt and Greece. Darwin had published his theory of evolution. The world seemed full of secrets waiting to be discovered, and Donnelly wrote like he was letting you in on the biggest secret of all. His central argument was simple. Everything we consider civilization, all of it came from Atlantis. Writing, mathematics, architecture, metallurgy, agriculture, religion, the whole package. The Egyptians didn't invent pyramids. They learned from Atlantean colonists. The Greeks didn't create their gods. They inherited garbled memories of Atlantean kings. The Maya and Aztecs didn't develop their civilizations independently. They were descended from Atlantean refugees who fled the destruction. Every advanced ancient culture, according to Donnelly, traced back to one source, one mother civilization, one island empire that spread its knowledge across the globe before sinking beneath the waves. The book was organized like a legal brief. Donnelly laid out 13 propositions and then defended each one with evidence. Proposition 1, there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean a large island, the remnant of an Atlantic continent. Proposition 2, Plato's account was not fiction but verifiable history. Proposition 3, Atlantis was the region where humans first rose from barbarism to civilization, and so on. 13 claims, each more sweeping than the last. He argued that the gods of ancient mythologies were really the kings and queens of Atlantis, their deeds exaggerated into supernatural achievements over thousands of years of storytelling. Zeus was an Atlantean king. Odin was, too, the Egyptian god Osiris, the Phoenician god Baal, the Hindu god Indra. All of the memories of real Atlantean rulers who had governed an empire spanning the globe. He claimed that the alphabet originated in Atlantis and spread from there to all the places that developed writing. He compared letter shapes between different ancient scripts, Egyptian hieroglyphics and Phoenician letters and even Central American glyphs, and argued they all derive from a common Atlantean source. The comparisons were creative. You have to give him that, and completely unfounded. He proposed that Atlantis was the original Garden of Eden, that the flood myth in Genesis preserved a memory of Atlantis's destruction, that somewhere in the human subconscious we all remembered Paradise Lost. It was a grand unified theory of human history, and Donnelly backed it up with mountains of evidence. Some of it was real. He cited actual archaeological discoveries, referenced genuine ancient texts, pointed to real similarities between distant cultures that scholars were still trying to explain. Some of it was garbage. He made up linguistic connections out of thin air, misread sources, cherry-picked data, ignored anything that contradicted his thesis. But readers couldn't tell the difference. Donnelly presented everything with the same confidence, the same authoritative tone. He had footnotes. He had bibliography entries. He sounded like he knew what he was talking about. And honestly, some of his questions were legitimate. Why do cultures on opposite sides of the Atlantic both build pyramids? The Egyptians did it. The Maya did it. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats. Even some early Chinese cultures built stepped mounds. That's a weird coincidence. Why do so many cultures have flood myths? The Bible has Noah. The Babylonians have Gilgamesh. The Greeks have Deucalion. Native American cultures have their own versions. Hindu mythology talks about great floods. It's almost universal. Why do ancient myths from different continents have similar elements? Sun gods, world trees, dying and rising heroes, underworld journeys. These patterns show up everywhere. Donnelly had answers. The pyramids were all copies of Atlantean architecture. The flood myths all mirrored the same event, the destruction of Atlantis. The mythological similarities came from a common Atlantean religion that spread with colonists. These answers were wrong. We know now that pyramids developed independently because a pyramid is basically the most stable way to pile up heavy stones. Flood myths are universal because floods are universal, happening wherever humans live near water. Mythological patterns repeat because human minds repeat. But In 1882, those explanations weren't available. Archaeology was young. Anthropology was younger. The scientific tools to trace human migrations and cultural development hadn't been invented yet. Donnelly filled the gap with confidence and imagination. His description of Atlantean society was vivid. He imagined a civilization that had mastered bronze and iron while the rest of the world used stone. A culture that understood astronomy and navigation centuries before anyone else. A trading empire whose ships reached every shore. He described their government, their religion, their colonies in Egypt and Greece and Mexico and Peru. He created an entire world out of speculation and scraps, and he put Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, right where Plato said it was. Specifically, he pointed to an underwater plateau that runs down the middle of the Atlantic, the same feature Bowie had noticed a century earlier. Donnelly argued this ridge was the remnant of a sunken continent. The peaks of its mountains now poked above water as the Azores. You drained the Atlantic Ocean, Donnelly suggested. You'd find the ruins of Atlantis sitting there, the temples, the canals, maybe even the bones of the Atlanteans themselves. It's worth pausing here to appreciate how wrong this is. The mid-Atlantic ridge isn't a sunken continent. It's a spreading center, a crack in the Earth's crust where new rock wells up from below, pushing the Americas slowly away from Europe and Africa. The ridge has never been above water, at least not since the first fish crawled onto land. But Donnelly didn't know about plate tectonics. Nobody did. That theory wouldn't be accepted until the 1960s. To him, the ridge looked like exactly what he needed, a drowned landmass in the right location. So, he built his theory on a foundation that would eventually crumble. But the building he erected was impressive enough that people kept living in it long after the foundation was gone. Donnelly also had a genius for the telling detail. He noted that bananas were cultivated on both sides of the Atlantic, and bananas can't survive an ocean crossing. Someone must have carried them, that someone must have had boats. Those boats must have come from somewhere in the middle. He pointed out that the Basque language spoken in Spain has no known relatives. It doesn't fit into the Indo-European family or any other language group we know of. Donnelly suggested the Basques were descendants of Atlanteans whose original language had survived. He collected legends from Irel and about an island in the west called High Brazil, legends from Africa about lands beyond the sunset, legends from everywhere really that might possibly maybe refer to Atlantis. Individually, each piece of evidence was weak. Plenty of plants got spread around by birds or ocean currents. Languages can be isolates for lots of reasons. Legends about magical islands are exactly the kind of thing people make up when they're staring at the horizon. But together, piled up over 500 pages, it started to feel overwhelming, like there must be something there. That's the magic trick of pseudoscience. Quantity becomes a substitute for quality. 100 bad arguments feel more convincing than one good argument just because there are more of them. Donnie's book created a template that Atlantis enthusiasts would follow for the next century and beyond. Start with Plato. Add every ancient mystery you can find. Draw connections that professional scholars would reject. Present it all with absolute certainty. The book also did something else important. It made Atlantis feel possible, not in a fairy tale way, in a scientific way. Donnelly wrote in the voice of a researcher presenting findings. He wasn't telling a story. He was making a case. And his case implied that Atlantis could be proven. Divers could explore the Azores. Archaeologists could look for Atlantean artifacts in Egypt and Mexico. Linguists could trace Atlantean words through modern languages. The mystery was solvable. That was incredibly attractive. The idea that you could actually find Atlantis, that the next expedition, the next discovery, the next breakthrough might crack it all open. It turned passive readers into active believers, people who would fund expeditions, write their own books, dedicate their lives to proving Donnelly right. The professional scientific community was less impressed. Most geologists laughed at the idea of a continent sinking in a day. The Earth's crust doesn't work like that. Continents are made of relatively light rock that floats on denser material below. They can't just drop. The forces required would be catastrophic beyond imagination. There would be evidence everywhere. Most archaeologists pointed out that Donnie's evidence was mostly wishful thinking. Yes, pyramids exist on both sides of the Atlantic, but they're built differently, in different time periods for different purposes. Egyptian pyramids were tombs. Mesoamerican pyramids were temple platforms. The similarities were superficial. Most linguists noted that his language comparisons were gibberish. You can make any two words seem related if you're flexible enough with how letters change. That's not how real historical linguistics works. Real connections require systematic patterns of sound changes documented across many words, not cherry-picked examples that happen to look alike. And historians pointed out that Donnelly misread or misread his sources constantly. He'd cite an ancient author saying something that supported his theory. And when you check the original, it would say something completely different, sometimes the opposite. But academic criticism moves slowly. Books and journal articles take time to publish. By the time scholars could organize a proper response, Donnie's ideas had already spread far beyond the reach of professional fact-checkers. That pattern would repeat through the 20th century. Popular pseudoscience always moves, faster than careful debunking. The exciting claim gets the headlines. The boring correction gets buried on page 12, but they couldn't stop the popular tide. Donnie's book sold and sold. It remained in print for decades, inspired dozens of imitators, influenced writers and thinkers across multiple fields, became for a generation the definitive popular account of Atlantis. It shaped how people thought about the lost civilization in ways that persist to this day. Before Donnelly, Atlantis was mostly a philosophical puzzle, a story from Plato that scholars debated. After Donnelly, Atlantis was a real place, a civilization with technologies and colonies and trade routes, something you could theoretically dig up and study. He also established Atlantis as an explanation for anything mysterious. Strange archaeology must be Atlantean, unexplained similarities between cultures, Atlantean influence, any ancient achievement that seemed too sophisticated for primitive people, definitely Atlantis. This became a problem because once you have a catch-all explanation, you stop looking for real answers. Professional archaeologists would spend the next century fighting Donnie's ghost. Every time they uncovered something interesting, someone would pop up claiming it proved Atlantis. Every time they tried to explain how ancient people actually developed their civilizations, some Donnelly follower would insist that it all came from a sunken island. The debate still happens today on YouTube, on History Channel specials, in Bookspur. Hatt borrowed Donnie's structure and confidence while updating his claims for a new century. He created a mythology, ND mythologies don't die easily. Donnelly himself basked in the attention or a while. He wrote more books. One argued that a comet had caused the destruction, covering the earth in fire before the flood. Another claimed that Francis Bacon secretly wrote Shakespeare's plays with coded messages hidden in the texts. Yeah, he went down rabbit holes. But the Atlantis book was his legacy, the thing that would outlast him. He died in 1901, just after the turn of the century. A new era was beginning. Radio, airplanes, relativity. The world was changing faster than no one could track, and Atlantis was changing too. Donnelly had made the Ost civilization respectable in a weird way. You could talk about Atlantis at arties wonder about it in public. It wasn't just a myth anymore, it was a history. That opened doors that led to some very strange places. Because here's what Donnelly didn't anticipate. On you convince people that Atlantis was real, they start imagining what it was really like. Not just the architecture, not just the trade routes, but the deeper stuff, the spirituality, the wisdom, the secrets. Donnelly wrote as a pseudoscientist. He wanted to be taken seriously by the academic establishment. Even if they rejected him, he tried to use evidence, however badly. He stayed more or less within the bounds of material reality. The people who came after him had different interests. They didn't want to find Atlantis with shovels and submarines. They wanted to access Atlantean wisdom through mystical means. They believed the Atlanteans had possessed spiritual knowledge that transcended ordinary science, powers of the mind, connections to higher planes of existence, secrets about the cosmos that modern materialism had forgotten. These ideas were already floating around. In the 1880s, mixing with Donnie's claims, creating something new, something weirder. Spiritualism was huge in that era. Seances, mediums, messages from the dead. People genuinely believed you could contact spirits through trance, dates, and automatic writing. And if you could contact the dead, why not contact the Atlanteans? Let your eyes close if they haven't already. The story is taking a turn here. Away from politicians and scholars toward dreamers and mystics. People who believed in things that couldn't be proven and didn't care. They were about to take Atlantis places Donnelly never imagined. Places that would make his cautious pseudoscientific approach look positively rational by comparison. But that's for later. Right now, just rest. The Atlantic Ocean is calm tonight, dark and quiet and very, very deep. Whatever's down there, it can wait. So can you. Her name was Helena Petrona Blavatsky. She was Russian, born in 1831, the same year as Donnelly, on the opposite side of the world. Her father was a military officer. Her mother wrote novels. Young Helena showed an early talent for making things up and convincing people they were true. By the time she was in her 42nd, she had traveled across 3 continents, claimed to have studied with Tibetan masters in hidden monasteries, and founded a new religious movement that would eventually influence everyone from Gandhi to the Nazis. She called it theosophy. The name meant divine wisdom, and it promised to reveal the secret history of the universe. Blavatsky was a force of nature, large, loud, charismatic. She chain-smoked hand-rolled cigarettes. She swore in multiple languages. She dominated every room she entered through sheer personality, and she was almost certainly a fraud. Her Tibetan masters never produced any evidence of their existence. Her ancient texts had a suspicious habit of appearing whenever she needed them and disappearing before anyone could verify them. Multiple investigations caught her, faking supernatural phenomena using trapdoors and hidden assistants to create the illusion of spiritual powers. The Society of Psychical Research, a British organization that tried to scientifically investigate claims of the paranormal, sent an investigator to examine Blavatsky in 1884. His report was devastating. He concluded that she was one of the most accomplished, ingenious, and interesting impostors in history. But none of that stopped her. People wanted to believe. The late 19th century was a strange time. Darwin had shaken religious certainty. Industrialization was transforming society. Old ways of understanding the world were crumbling, and into that void stepped Blavatsky, offering a new story, a bigger story, a story that made sense of everything. Theosophy promised to reconcile science and religion, to explain evolution as a spiritual process, to connect Eastern mysticism with Western longing, to provide meaning in an age when meaning seemed increasingly hard to find. In 1888, she published The Secret Doctrine, 2 massive volumes laying out a complete, alternative history of the cosmos, and Atlantis was right at the center of it. According to Blavatsky, human evolution didn't work the way Darwin said. We didn't descend from apes through gradual adaptation. Instead, humanity passed through a series of root races, each with its own continent, its own characteristics, its own spiritual destiny. The first root race was barely physical at all, ethereal beings on an ethereal continent. The second was slightly more solid. The third was the Lemurians, who lived on a now sunken continent in the Pacific and had psychic powers, but not much intelligence. The fourth root race, that was the Atlanteans and Blavatsky's Atlantans, were nothing like Donnie's. Donnelly had imagined a civilization of sailors and traders, basically ancient Greeks with better engineering. Blavatsky's Atlanteans were giants, literal giants, 8 trillions tall. They possessed psychic abilities that modern humans have lost: telepathy, clairvoyance, the power to manipulate matter with their minds. They didn't need ships. They had flying machines powered by spiritual energy. They didn't need writing. They communicated through direct mental transmission. They didn't need religion. They had direct contact with higher beings on other planes of existence. This was Atlantis as science, fiction, or maybe fantasy. The technology wasn't mechanical, it was magical. Crystal-powered devices that tapped into cosmic forces, cities built with levitation rather than cranes. A civilization that had transcended physical limitations through spiritual advancement, and then they fell. Blavatsky's version of the fall wasn't about moral corruption, though that played a role. It was about the misuse of spiritual power. Some Atlanteans turned to dark magic. They used their psychic abilities for selfish purposes. They created abominations through twisted spiritual science. The destruction that followed wasn't just geological, it was karmic. The universe itself rejected what Atlantis had become. The continent sank not because of earthquake, but because the collective negative energy of the Atlanteans made it impossible for their land to remain in the physical world. Heavy stuff. The survivors scattered. Some went east to found what would become Egypt and India. Some went west to the Americas. They carried fragments of Atlantean wisdom with them, establishing mystery schools and secret traditions that preserved ancient knowledge for initiates. According to Blavatsky, these mystery schools still existed, hidden, guarded, waiting for humanity to evolve enough to receive their teachings again. And theosophy conveniently was the key to accessing that hidden wisdom. You can see how this worked as a recruitment pitch. Join our organization, and you'll be connected to the secret spiritual tradition that stretches back to Atlantis itself. The teachings that powered flying machines and red mines, the knowledge that built a civilization of gods. It's a good sales pitch. Thousands of people bought it. Theosophy spread across Europe and America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It attracted artists, writers, intellectuals, people who felt that mainstream religion was too stuffy and mainstream science was too materialistic, people who wanted wonder and mystery and the feeling that there was more to reality than what their senses showed them. The movement splintered, as movements do. After Blavatsky died in 1891, her followers fought over who would lead the organization and what direction it would take. One of the splinter groups was led by a German named Rudolf Steiner. Steiner had been a theosophist, but decided Blavatsky's approach was too Eastern, too focused on Asian mysticism. At the expense of Western spiritual traditions, he broke away and founded his own movement, called it anthroposophy. His version of Atlantis was even more elaborate than Blavatsky's. Steiner claimed to have developed clairvoyant abilities that let him directly perceive spiritual realities, including the history of previous civilizations. He didn't need ancient texts or archaeological evidence. He could simply look into what he called the Akashic records, a kind of cosmic library where every event that ever happened was stored, and what he saw was remarkable. Steiner's Atlanteans lived in an environment completely different from our own. The air was thicker, almost like mist. The land was soft and pliable. The division between sleeping and waking wasn't as sharp. Atlanteans lived in a kind of permanent dream state, perceiving the spiritual world as easily as we perceive the physical. They didn't think the way we think. Our modern analytical intelligence, our ability to reason logically and abstractly, that didn't exist yet. Instead, Atlanteans had direct intuitive knowledge. They understood things without having to figure them out. They could communicate with plants and animals. They could sense the life forces flowing through all things. Their technology reflected this different consciousness. They built machines that work through living forces rather than mechanical principles. Vehicles powered by the growth energy of seeds. Tools that responded to mental commands everything organic, growing, alive. Steiner spent hundreds of lectures describing Atlantean society in extraordinary detail. The different subraces, the spiritual teachers who guided them, the temples where they practiced their sacred science, the slow decline as material thinking began to replace intuitive wisdom. He presented all of this as simple fact, not speculation, not mythology, direct observation from the Akashic records. Nobody could check his work. Of course, the Akashic records were only accessible to people with sufficiently developed clairvoyant abilities, and conveniently, Steiner's own observations couldn't be contradicted by anyone else's. It's the ultimate unfalsifiable claim. I know because I can see things you can't see. Trust me. The weird thing is Steiner wasn't obviously crazy. He was intelligent, articulate, and productive. He wrote dozens of books, delivered thousands of lectures, created practical systems for education, farming, and medicine that people still use. How do you reconcile that with the guy who claimed to personally witness Atlantean civilization through psychic vision, maybe compartmentalization, maybe different standards of truth for different domains? Maybe he genuinely believed what he was saying and had convinced himself his visions were real. Or maybe in the end it doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed him, and his version of Atlantis became part of the cultural atmosphere, mixing with Blavatsky's version and Donnie's version and Plato's version into a soup that nobody could untangle anymore. But people did trust him. Anthroposophy grew into a substantial movement. It founded schools, the Waldorf education system, that still exists today. It developed its own approach to agriculture called biodynamic farming. It influenced art and architecture and medicine, all of it built on a foundation that included Atlantis as literal spiritual history. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, an even stranger figure was emerging. Edgar Cayce was a photographer from Kentucky, unremarkable in most ways, quiet, religious, not particularly educated. He worked in a portrait studio taking pictures of families and businessmen, but Cayce had a talent when he went into a trance state. Lying down with his eyes closed, he could apparently access information he had no normal way of knowing. He'd answer questions about people's health problems, describing symptoms and recommending treatments with surprising accuracy. Doctors started referring patients to him. The press nicknamed him the Sleeping Prophet. Starting in the 1920s, Cayce's trance readings began including information about past lives. He'd tell people they had lived in ancient Egypt or medieval France or biblical Israel, and increasingly he told them they had lived in Atlantis. Over the course of about 20 years, Cayce delivered hundreds of readings that referenced the lost civilization. Piece by piece, his trance statements assembled a detailed picture of what Atlantis had been like. According to Cayce, Atlantis existed from about 200,000 BC until its final destruction around 10,000 BC. That's a civilization lasting almost 200,000 years. For comparison, all of recorded human history is only about 5,000 years. The Atlanteans went through multiple periods of development and destruction, not one cataclysm but several. The continent broke apart gradually over thousands of years with different sections sinking at different times. At their peak, Cayce's Atlanteans had technology we haven't matched yet. Flying machines and submarines, ray weapons that could destroy armies, electrical power generated by massive crystals that tapped into cosmic energy. The crystals were central to Cayce's vision. He called the main power source the Tui, stone or firestone, a massive crystal possibly created rather than natural that could concentrate solar and cosmic energies for various purposes: healing, power generation, communication, destruction. In fact, it was the misuse of this crystal technology that caused the final destruction. The Atlanteans had figured out how to turn their power crystals into weapons. They used them against their enemies, and eventually, the concentrated energy destabilized the geological foundations of the continent itself. Cayce's Atlantis wasn't just a historical curiosity, it had implications for the present. He claimed that many souls who had lived in Atlantis were now reincarnating in the 20th century. They were drawn to technology, to science, to the same kinds of power that had destroyed their civilization before. They had karma to work out, lessons to learn, mistakes not to repeat, and he made predictions. Casey said that records from Atlantis had been hidden in 3 locations before the final destruction. One cache was under the Sphinx in Egypt, another was in the Yucatan Peninsula. The third was somewhere near the Bahamas. These records would be discovered, he said, when humanity was ready. They would prove Atlantis existed. They would reveal the secrets of Atlantean technology and wisdom. He even gave a date, the late 20th century. Specifically, he mentioned 1968 and 1969 as significant years for discoveries related to Atlantis. That prediction would have consequences we'll get to later. Here's what made Casey different from Blavatsky and Steiner. He seemed sincere. He didn't get rich from his readings. He didn't build an empire. He just kept doing what he did year after year, answering questions in his trance state and letting other people figure out what it meant. His followers would sometimes travel to the places he mentioned, looking for the hidden records, the Bahamas, the Yucatan, Egypt. They never found the caches of Atlantean documents, but they kept looking, and his medical readings. Some of them actually helped people, or seemed to enough that doctors and patients kept coming. Enough that his reputation as a healer was at least as strong as his reputation for past life readings. That made him harder to dismiss than the others. Blavatsky was flamboyant and got caught cheating. Steiner was an intellectual who built elaborate philosophical systems. Casey was just a guy, a normal American guy who happened to see things when he closed his eyes. Normal people could relate to that. They couldn't relate to Tibetan masters or Ashik records, but a regular person with an unusual gift that felt possible. Casey died in 1945. His followers organized his readings into a massive archive. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, based in Virginia Beach, continues to study and promote his work today. Between Blavatsky, Steiner, and Casey, Atlantis had been transformed completely. Donnie's version was pseudoscience, wrong, but at least trying to engage with evidence and archaeology. These newer versions were pure mysticism, Atlantis as spiritual truth accessible only through esoteric practices. Atlantis as a chapter in the evolution of the human soul. Atlantis as a warning from past lives about the dangers of technology without wisdom. This is the Atlantis that seeped into popular culture through the 20th century. The crystals, the psychic powers, the advanced technology indistinguishable from magic, the spiritual decline that brought destruction. When you see Atlantis in movies or video games or comic books, this is usually the version you're getting, not Plato's philosophical allegory, not Donnie's pseudo-archaeological speculation, but the mystical Atlantis of theosophy and its descendants. It's a long way from that garden in Athens, where an old philosopher made up a story to illustrate his ideas about politics. Your eyelids are probably heavy by now. That's good. Let them rest. The mystics saw Atlantis in their visions, in trance states, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, where the mind loosens its grip on ordinary reality. You're in that kind of space now. The darkness behind your eyes, the soft weight of your body settling into the bed, the story drifting somewhere, between memory and dream. Atlantis is down there in the deep water, in the collective imagination, in the strange place where history and mythology blur together. We're almost at the end of this journey. Almost. A few more steps. Modern science would finally weigh in. With submarines and sonar and satellite imaging, with geology and archaeology and hard evidence, they went looking for Atlantis with the tools of the 20th century. And they found something, but not what anyone expected. Rest now. The scientific expedition can wait until you're ready. The ocean isn't going anywhere. Neither is the mystery. Remember that prediction Edgar Casey made, the one about 1968 and 1969 being significant years for Atlantis discoveries? Well, something did happen in 1968. A pilot named Robert Brush was flying over the shallow waters near Bimini in the Bahamas when he spotted something strange on the seafloor. A pattern. Rectangular shapes arranged in what looked like a road or a wall. Straight lines that nature doesn't usually make, he told some friends. Word spread, and pretty soon divers were in the water, examining what became known as the Bimini Road. What they found was a series of large rectangular stones roughly arranged in a line running about half a mile along the ocean floor. The stones were limestone, some of them enormous. They looked to excited eyes like paving stones, like the remains of a road or a foundation. The timing was almost too perfect. Casey had said records of Atlantis would be found near the Bahamas around 1968, and here was something right when he said his followers went nuts. This was it. Proof. Vindication. The sleeping prophet had seen the truth, and now the truth was revealing itself to the world. Divers and researchers descended on Bimini. They measured the stones, photographed them, took samples, argued about what they were seeing. Some claimed to find tool marks on the stones. Others said they detected a second layer beneath the visible one, suggesting deliberate construction. A few reported finding carved heads and artifacts in the surrounding sand, though these objects had a habit of disappearing before they could be properly documented. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, Casey's organization, funded multiple expeditions. They were determined to prove their prophet right. They brought in psychics to dhows for additional structures. They hired boats and divers and underwater cameras. The media loved it. Atlantis found. Headlines appeared in newspapers and magazines, television. Crews filmed divers swimming along the underwater formation. For a moment it seemed like the mystery might finally be solved. Except geologists who examined the Bimini Road came to a different conclusion. The stones weren't cut or shaped by human hands. They were beach rock, a type of limestone that forms naturally in tropical shallows. And beach rock has a habit of fracturing along straight lines, creating rectangular shapes that can look artificial. The road wasn't a road, it was a natural geological formation. The same kind of formation you can find in dozens of other places around the Caribbean. Nothing special about it except the timing of its discovery and the hopes people projected onto it. But try telling that to the believers. The Bimini Road became a fixture of Atlantis literature. Books were written about it, documentaries filmed, expeditions launched to find more evidence in the surrounding waters. The fact that mainstream geologists dismissed it as natural didn't matter. For true believers, that dismissal was just more proof of closed-minded establishment thinking. This pattern would repeat throughout the 20th century. Someone would find something that looked unusual. Atlantis enthusiasts would declare it proof. Scientists would explain what it actually was. The enthusiasts would ignore the explanation and keep believing. It's exhausting, honestly, for everyone involved. But the scientific investigation of Atlantis-related questions was happening, even if it wasn't finding what the believers wanted. The most serious scientific engagement with the Atlantis question came from an unexpected direction. Not the Atlantic Ocean, not the Bahamas, but the Aegean Sea in the waters around a crescent-shaped island called Santorini. Santorini is what's left of a volcano. If you visit today, you'll see a ring of islands surrounding a deep lagoon. The lagoon is actually a crater, the collapsed crater of a volcano that blew itself apart roughly 30,600 years ago, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The eruption happened around 1600 BC, give or take a few decades. Dating ancient volcanic events is tricky, and scientists have argued about the exact timing for years. But somewhere in the ballpark of 1600 BC, this volcano exploded with a force that dwarfed anything in recorded history. For comparison, the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 killed over 36,000 people and could be heard thousands of miles away. The Santorini eruption was probably 4 times larger, maybe more. The explosion would have been visible from Egypt. The tsunamis would have devastated coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean. The ash cloud would have affected weather patterns for years. Agriculture would have failed, civilizations would have struggled, and there was a civilization nearby, a sophisticated, wealthy, powerful civilization that seems to have collapsed right around the time of the eruption, the Minoans. We talked about them earlier when we discussed how Spanish conquistadors compared the Aztecs to Plato's description. But now we need to look at them more closely because a Greek archaeologist named Spiridon Marinatos spent his career arguing that the Minoans were the real Atlantis. Marinatos wasn't a crackpot. He was a serious scholar, director of the Greek Archaeological Service, a respected figure in his field, and he had noticed something interesting. Minoan sites on Crete, the main Minoan island, showed evidence of sudden destruction around the time of the Santorini eruption. Thick deposits of volcanic ash, signs of tsunami damage, buildings collapsed and never rebuilt. And the Minoan civilization, which had been flourishing for centuries, suddenly declined after this period. Within a generation or two, the palaces were abandoned. The sophisticated culture that had produced incredible art and architecture simply stopped. What if, Marinatos wondered, the Santorini eruption had destroyed Minoan civilization? And what if memories of that destruction had been preserved in Egyptian records, eventually reaching Plato and becoming the basis for his Atlantis story? It was a testable hypothesis. Unlike the mystical claims of Blavatsky or Casey, this could actually be investigated with archaeological tools. In 1967, Marinatos began excavating on Santorini itself. At a site called Akriri on the southern part of the island, he started digging through layers of volcanic ash. What he found was remarkable. A city, a complete Bronze Age city preserved under 60 feet, of volcanic pumice, buildings still standing to their second and third stories, streets, squares, workshops, homes with pottery still sitting on shelves. It was like Pompeii, but older, much older, and in some ways better preserved. The ash had fallen so quickly and so deeply that it created a perfect seal. Air couldn't get in, decay couldn't happen. Even organic materials, things that normally rot away in centuries, had survived for 3,500 years. Marinatos found beds with their wooden frames intact, baskets still holding their contents, ropes still coiled. The carbonized remains of food in storage jars. It was like the whole city had been frozen in time. But here's the strange thing. No bodies. Pompeii is famous for its plaster cast of victims, people caught in the moment of death by the falling ash. Akriri had none of that. Not a single skeleton in all the excavated areas. Not even animal bones. The people got out, all of them. They saw the warning signs, the earthquakes that must have preceded the main eruption, and they fled. They took their valuables, their families, their livestock, and they left. We don't know where they went. We don't know if they survived the tsunamis that followed the eruption, but they weren't in the city when the end came. That makes Akriri a snapshot of daily life rather than death. A city as it was lived in, not as it was abandoned in panic. The buildings had indoor plumbing, toilets that flushed with water, drainage systems, hot and cold running water, apparently heated by the volcanic activity beneath the island. The walls were covered in fresco, paintings of ships and dolphins, and women gathering saffron, boxing boys, fishermen holding their catch, monkeys climbing rocks. The artwork was stunning, comparable to anything produced in the ancient world. This was a wealthy, sophisticated society, a society that traded with Egypt and the Levant and the Greek mainland. A society that had achieved a level of comfort and artistry that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. And it had been buried in a single, catastrophic event. The parallels to Atlantis were obvious. An island, civilization, advanced technology for its time, sudden destruction by natural disaster. The timing was off, way off, since Plato put Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, instead of 900. But maybe that was just a mistake. Maybe the Egyptian priests had confused their numbers. Maybe Plato had added a zero for dramatic effect. The Minoan theory became the most respectable scientific hypothesis for a real-world Atlantis. It appeared in academic journals, got discussed at conferences, made it into textbooks. Marinatos kept digging until his death in 1974. He died at the site. Actually, fell from a wall he was examining and never recovered. Some people thought that was poetic, others thought it was just sad. The excavations continued after him. They're still going on today. Akrotiri is now a major archaeological site covered by a protective roof open to tourists who want to walk the streets of a city that was old when Troy was young. But here's the problem with the Minoan theory. It doesn't really match Plato's description. Atlantis was supposed to be beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. That's what the name means. Santorini is in the Aegean, the opposite direction from Gibraltar. Atlantis was supposed to be larger than Libya and Asia combined. Santorini, even before the eruption, was a small island, maybe 10 miles across. You couldn't fit a 1,000,000-man army on it. Atlantis was supposed to have threatened Athens in a great war. There's no evidence the Minoans ever fought Athens. In fact, there's no evidence Athens even existed as a significant settlement during the Minoan period. The theory requires you to assume that Plato or his sources got almost everything wrong except the basic concept of an island civilization destroyed by catastrophe. The location is wrong, the size is wrong, the timeline is wrong, the political situation is wrong. At that point, what are you really saying? That Plato heard vague rumors about a volcanic eruption and invented everything else? That's possible, but it's not exactly a ringing endorsement of Atlantis as historical memory. Other scientists looked in other places. The Spanish coast, the Sahara Desert, which some researchers argued had been underwater in ancient times, the Black Sea, where underwater surveys found evidence of ancient flooding, Antarctica, where a few fringe theorists claimed an ice-free civilization had once existed. Each location had its advocates. Each had its evidence interpreted creatively. Each generated books and documentaries and conference presentations. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic, turned his attention to ancient shipwrecks and submerged settlements. He explored the Black Sea floor and found well-preserved wooden structures from the Bronze Age, remains of communities that had been flooded when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. That was genuinely exciting. Real archaeology of real submerged sites, proof that ancient communities had indeed been lost to rising waters. But it wasn't Atlantis. The settlements were small fishing villages, nothing like the imperial capital Plato described. Underwater archaeologists explored the Atlantic floor with sonar and submersibles. They mapped the mid-Atlantic ridge in detail. They found underwater mountains and volcanic vents and bizarre ecosystems around thermal springs. They didn't find cities. They didn't find temples. They didn't find anything that looked like human construction. The ocean floor of the Atlantic has been surveyed extensively since the 1960s, first by naval vessels doing Cold War reconnaissance, then by research ships mapping the geology, then by oil companies looking for drilling sites, then by telecommunications companies laying cables. If there were ruins down there, someone would have noticed by now. The seafloor tells its own story, and that story doesn't include sunken continents. The Atlantic has been an ocean for millions of years. The crust beneath it is oceanic crust, thin and dense, nothing like the continental crust that would have supported a landmass. There's no mechanism by which a continent could have existed there and then sunk. Geologists are very confident about this. The evidence is overwhelming. Plate tectonics explains the shape of the Atlantic, the ages of the rocks, the magnetic patterns in the seafloor. It all fits together into a coherent picture that leaves no room for Atlantis. This isn't closed-minded thinking. It's the way science works. When you have a well-supported theory that explains the evidence, You don't throw it out because someone wants to believe in a legend. You'd need extraordinary evidence to overturn plate tectonics, and no one has provided it. Some Atlantis enthusiasts argue that scientists are hiding something, that there's a conspiracy to suppress the truth, that the establishment is protecting its turf. But think about what that would require. Thousands of geologists and oceanographers and archaeologists from dozens of countries, all agreeing to keep a secret, all of them resisting the temptation to become famous by revealing the truth, all of them coordinating their cover-up across languages and political systems and competing institutions. That's not how science works. Scientists love proving each other wrong. It's how you make your reputation. If someone had real evidence for Atlantis, other scientists would be fighting to confirm it and share the credit. This simpler explanation is that there's nothing to find. But absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, right? Maybe we haven't looked in the right place yet. Maybe Atlantis is under the ice in Antarctica. Maybe it's buried under sediment in some unexplored corner of the ocean. Maybe the ruins are there, but we don't recognize them for what they are. These are the arguments that keep the search alive. The possibility, however, slim, that the next expedition might find something, that the next sonar sweep might reveal structures hidden in the deep. Hope is a powerful thing. It can survive a lot of disappointment. Your body is probably very relaxed now. The weight of the blankets, the darkness behind your eyes, the gentle rhythm of your breathing. We followed this story a long way. From Plato's garden to Blavatsky's seances to Marinatos digging through volcanic ash, from philosophy to pseudoscience to real science and back again. The search continues. You know, people are still looking, still hoping, still finding patterns in the noise and declaring them proof. Maybe they'll find something someday. Stranger things have happened. Or maybe Atlantis will remain what it's always been, a story, a mirror, a way for humans to think about what we might become and what we might lose. There's something peaceful about that. Not every mystery needs a solution. Some questions are more valuable than their answers. Rest now. Let the water close over the ruins. Let the sediments settle. The final chapter of this story isn't about the search. It's about what Atlantis means, why it endures, why after 2,400 years we still can't let it go. But that can wait until you're ready. The ocean is patient. So is the dark. The search never really stopped. Every few years someone announces a new discovery, a sonar image that looks like buildings, satellite photos showing geometric patterns in the ocean, ancient maps that supposedly prove advanced navigation existed before recorded history. Google Earth made it worse. Suddenly, anyone with an internet connection could scan the ocean floor for anomalies. People found rectangular shapes, straight lines, grids that looked too regular to be natural. Most of it was digital noise. Artifacts of how the mapping software stitched together different data sources. But that didn't stop. The press releases didn't stop the YouTube videos. It didn't stop people insisting they'd found the real Atlantis in their bedrooms staring at a computer screen. In 2009, ABR, British aeronautical engineers, spotted a grid pattern on Google Earth in the Atlantic west of the Canary Islands. It looked like streets, a city plan. The story went viral before anyone could heck. Turns out, it was sonar data. The lines were boat tracks, paths where research vessels had traveled back and forth collecting depth measurements. Nothing more mysterious than the wake of scientific survey. But for a few days, the headlines read like vindication. Atlantis found the truth at last. In 2011, a researcher claimed to have found Atlantis in southern Spain in marshlands near the coast. The site showed on centric rings visible from satellite images. The timing matched an ancient tsunami. The location was plausibly near the Pillars of Hercules. National Geographic made a documentary about it. The scientific community shrugged. The rings were natural geological formations. The site was interesting for other reasons, post Siebel Tartessian ruins from the first millennium BC. But it wasn't Atlantis. It was too small, too recent, too different from what Plato described. Same story, different decade. In 2018, another researcher claimed to find Atlantis off the coast of Morocco. Satellite imagery again, geometric patterns again, confident claims again. The pattern repeats because it works. It generates headlines, sells books, gets television specials made. There's an audience for Atlantis discoveries, and that audience doesn't much care whether the scientific community is convinced. But something shifted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Atlantis stopped being just a historical mystery. It became entertainment. Jules Verne had started that process back in the 1870s with his submarine captain, finding Atlantean ruins in 20,000 leagues under the sea. But the real explosion came with movies and television. Disney made an animated film in 2001, Atlantis: The Lost Empire, giant robots, crystal technology, an underground civilization surviving in secret. It flopped at the box office, actually, but it showed how thoroughly Atlantis had been absorbed into the vocabulary of adventure storytelling. The same year, the TV series Stargate spun off into Stargate Atlantis, imagining the lost city as an alien spacecraft. Aquaman in DC Comics ruled Atlantis as an underwater kingdom. Marvel had Neymar the Submariner doing the same thing. Video games set players exploring Atlantean ruins in everything from Tomb Ra, Eider to Assassin's Creed. The mystic version, the one with crystals and psychic powers, became the default. Not Plato's philosophical allegory, not Donnie's pseudo-scientific speculation, the Blavatsky-Casey version where Atlantis was essentially magical, where its technology was indistinguishable from sorcery. That version is more fun. Honestly, it makes for better movies, but it also shows how far we've drifted from the source. Plato would barely recognize what his story has become. The original was a political parable, a warning about corruption and hubris. It was about Athens, really, about what Athens had become after the Peloponnesian War. The foreign empire was a mirror, not a mystery. But try putting that in a summer blockbuster. Modern audiences want action, visual spectacle, clear villains and heroes. They want underwater cities with glowing crystals and ancient war machines activated by the power of belief. The philosophical Atlantis is too subtle, too ambiguous. It asks questions instead of providing answers. It makes you uncomfortable instead of entertained. So we get the other version, the one where Atlantis is basically a superhero origin story. Ancient technology waiting to be rediscovered, hidden knowledge that could change everything, the promise of power for whoever finds it first. It's not what Plato wrote, but it's what we want to hear. And then there's the ancient aliens phenomenon. If you've watched the History Channel in the past 15 years, you know what I'm talking about. That series where every ancient mystery gets explained by extraterrestrial intervention. The pyramids, aliens, Stonehenge, aliens, the Nazca lines, definitely aliens. The show has been running since 2009, over 200 episodes. It's one of the most successful programs the History Channel has ever produced, and Atlantis comes up constantly. Some ancient aliens proponents argue that the Atlanteans were extraterrestrials, or that they were humans who received technology from alien visitors, the crystal power sources, the flying machines. All of it makes more sense if you assume otherworldly help. Others take it further. They claim that Atlantis was a staging ground for alien colonization of Earth, that the Atlanteans were hybrids, part human and part extraterrestrial, that their destruction was the result of some cosmic war we can barely comprehend. The theories get wilder and wilder. That's what happens when you free yourself from evidence. There's no limiting principle, no way to say, okay, that's too far. If aliens could do one thing, they could do anything. The speculation becomes infinite. Does it need to be said that there's no evidence for any of this? That the ancient aliens thesis requires ignoring everything we actually know about ancient human capabilities? That it's fundamentally insulting to suggest that our ancestors couldn't have built impressive things without help from space? Probably not. You already know. But millions of people watch those hows, buy the books. believe at least a little that the official history is incomplete, that there are secrets being kept, that somewhere in the past something extraordinary happened that the establishment doesn't want us to know about. The internet has made this worse or better, depending on your perspective. Anyone can publish anything now. The gatekeepers are gone. You can find communities online that believe in every possible theory about Atlantis, crystal technology, alien origins, and Arctic locations, spiritual dimensions. They share evidence, reinforce each other's beliefs, create entire alternative histories that have nothing to do with mainstream scholarship, but feel just as real to the people inside them. It's a parallel universe of knowledge, separate from academia, separate from science, following its own rules. Atlantis has become a symbol of that feeling, the sense that there's more to history than the textbooks tell us, that ancient people knew things we've forgotten, that advanced civilizations have risen and fallen before, and ours might not be as special as we think. It's a seductive worldview, and it's not entirely wrong, even if the specifics are nonsense. Ancient people were clever. They built amazing things with limited technology. They observed the stars with naked eyes and developed sophisticated astronomical systems. They crossed oceans in boats we'd consider death traps. They created art and literature that still moves us thousands of years later. We underestimate them constantly, and every time, archaeologists discover something unexpected, something that suggests ancient people were more capable than we thought. It feeds the suspicion that maybe there's more we don't know, maybe there are discoveries still waiting to be made. Maybe Atlantis is one of them. Consider what the Egyptians actually accomplished. They built the Great Pyramid using copper tools and human muscle. 2 million stone blocks, some weighing more than 50 tons, stacked with precision we'd struggle to match today. They did it without wheels, without iron, without any of the technologies we consider essential for large construction projects. And they left records. We know how they did it. Ramps and levers and thousands of workers and decades of effort. It's impressive. Precisely because it was human, because they figured it out with the tools they had. Same with the Romans and their aqueducts, the Maya and their calendar, the Polynesians crossing thousands of miles of open ocean in canoes, navigating by stars and currents and the flight patterns of birds. None of this required aliens. None of it required Atlantean survivors teaching secret techniques. It just required human ingenuity applied over generations, accumulated through trial and error. But that explanation feels insufficient somehow, too. We want our ancestors to have had help. We want there to be a secret. The trouble is, maybe isn't evidence. And the gap between ancient people were impressive and ancient people had flying machines powered by crystals is enormous. But let's step back for a moment. Let's ask a different question. Why does this story persist? 2,400 years. That's how long Atlantis has been with us. One dialogue by one philosopher, and it's still generating books and movies and television specials and internet arguments in the 21st century. Why? Part of it is the mystery itself. Humans love mysteries where pattern-seeking creatures and an unsolved puzzle itches at us. We want to know. We need to know. The uncertainty is almost painful, and Atlantis is the ultimate unsolved puzzle, big enough to matter, old enough to be romantic, just plausible enough that you can't quite dismiss it entirely. Think about it. We've solved so many mysteries. We know what causes lightning. We know how diseases spread. We can predict eclipses and explain rainbows and sequence the human genome. The world has gotten smaller, more explained, more mapped. But some things resist explanation. Some questions don't have clean answers, and those questions draw us like moths to flames. Atlantis survives partly because we need mysteries, because a world without them would feel flat and finished, because wondering is its own kind of pleasure. Part of it is the fantasy of lost knowledge. We live in an age of information overload. We have access to more data than any humans in history. And yet things still feel out of control. Problems still seem unsolvable. The future still looks scary. Climate to change, political division, economic inequality, pandemic disease. The challenges keep coming, and our solutions never seem quite adequate. What if there was wisdom we'd forgotten? What if the ancients knew something we don't? What if recovering that knowledge could save us? It's a comforting thought. Even if it's not true, it's comforting. It suggests that solutions exist, that progress isn't the only option, that we can look backward as well as forward. Every generation has felt this way. Every generation has looked at its problems and wished for some lost golden age when people knew better. The Romans idealized the early republic. The medieval Europeans idealized Rome. The Renaissance idealized Greece. And everyone at some point has idealized Atlantis. We project our hopes onto the past because the future is too frightening. Part of it is the warning. Plato's original story was about corruption and collapse, a great civilization that lost its virtue and was destroyed. That's a universal theme. Every generation worries about decline. Every empire wonders if it's next. Atlantis gives that worry a shape, a precedent. Look, it says this happened before. It can happen again. In the atomic age, that resonance got stronger. Suddenly, humanity had the power to destroy itself. The Atlantean catastrophe didn't seem quite so mythological anymore. We could see how it might happen. We could imagine the waters closing over our own civilization. And now, with climate change and rising seas, the image has gained new potency. Coastal cities threatened by flooding. Island nations disappearing beneath the waves. Civilizations undone by environmental changes they helped cause. We don't need to believe in Atlantis to feel its truth. The story works because it captures something real about human vulnerability, about the gap between our power and our wisdom. We can build wonders, but we can also destroy them. We can rise to greatness, but we can fall just as far. Atlantis is a reminder, a memento mori for civilizations, and part of it, honestly, is just good storytelling. Plato knew what he was doing, the concentric rings, the golden walls, the bulls sacrificed in the temple, the slow corruption of a noble people, the sudden total destruction. These are powerful images. They stick in the mind. They generate more images, more stories, more variations on the theme. Think about what makes a story memorable. Vivid details, emotional stakes, a clear structure with beginning, middle, and end. Characters you can imagine, even if they're sketched briefly. A world that feels real, even if it's fantastic. Plato's Atlantis has all of that. The description of the city is detailed enough to visualize. The decline from virtue to corruption is psychologically believable. The ending is catastrophic and final. It's a complete narrative, even though it's technically unfinished. We know how it ends. The water rises, the city falls, everything is lost. A bad story would have been forgotten. A forgettable story would have vanished with the Library of Alexandria. But Atlantis survives because it works. As literature, as myth, as a hook for the imagination, we remember things that move us. And Atlantis moves us, has been moving us for 24 centuries, will probably keep moving us for centuries to come. Maybe that's enough. Maybe Atlantis doesn't have to be real to be meaningful. Maybe the search matters more than the finding. Maybe the questions are more valuable than any answer could be. There's something beautiful about that. Actually, a story that keeps giving without ever quite arriving. A mystery that rewards engagement without demanding solution. Some of the most important things in life are like that. Love, meaning, purpose. You don't solve them, you live them. You keep asking the questions even when answers don't come. Atlantis might be the same. A question worth asking forever. A dream worth having again and again. Your eyes are probably closed by now or closing. The heaviness of sleep pulling you down like water. That's okay. That's good. We're almost done. One more section, one more piece of the puzzle. Not an answer exactly, but a way of thinking about answers, a way of holding the mystery without needing to solve it. Atlantis is down there somewhere in the deep water, in the collective dream we've been having for 2,000 years. It doesn't have to be real to be true. Some stories are bigger than facts. Rest now. Let the images drift. The golden temple. The crystal towers. The water rising over everything. It's been a long journey. From Athens to Virginia Beach. From philosophy to pseudoscience to Hollywood. One more step when you're ready. The ending is gentle, I promise. So, here we are at the end of a story that doesn't really have an ending. We started in a garden in Athens, an old man writing about a world that might never have existed. And we've traveled through 2,400 years of human hoping and searching and dreaming, scholars and crackpots, scientists and mystics, congressmen and psychics, all of them reaching for the same thing, all of them convinced they were close to an answer. And now you're here in your bed in the dark, listening to a story about a story about a story. It's stories all the way down, isn't it? That's the thing about Atlantis. You can never quite get to the bottom of it. Every answer opens more questions. Every discovery reveals more mystery. The island keeps sinking deeper and deeper into layers of interpretation and imagination. Let's go back to Plato one more time. Not to repeat what we said before, but to see him differently. Now that we know what happened after. He was 70 years old, give or take, writing in the twilight of his life. His greatest student had already left to found his own school. His political dreams had failed spectacularly. The perfect society he'd imagined in the Republic existed only on papyrus, and he chose to write about a lost civilization. Why? Maybe it was just a teaching tool, a vivid example to illustrate abstract ideas. Philosophers do that. They make up scenarios to clarify their arguments. Nothing unusual about it, but maybe it was something more. Maybe Plato looked at his own life and saw Atlantis everywhere. Athens had been great once, had stood against the Persian Empire when everyone else surrendered, had built the Parthenon and invented democracy and produced Socrates, had been for a brief shining moment exactly the kind of virtuous society Plato admired, and then it rotted. The Peloponnesian War, the plague, the Sicilian disaster, the rule of the 30 tyrants, including Plato's own relatives, the execution of Socrates, the slow decline from golden age to something grayer and meaner. Plato had watched his city become the thing it once fought against, had seen power corrupt and virtue erode, and good people make terrible choices. Sound familiar? Atlantis was Athens, or could have been, or might still become. The story wasn't really about an island in the Atlantic. It was about what happens to civilizations when they lose their way, when they start to believe that power is its own justification, when the divine spark gets diluted by too much human ambition. Plato was writing a warning not about the past, about the future. And here's the strange part. The warning worked not because anyone took it literally, not because people read Plato and reform their societies, but because the story survived, because generation after generation kept telling it, kept adding to it, kept finding new meanings in it. Every age gets the Atlantis it needs. The Renaissance got a lost world of classical wisdom waiting to be recovered. The 19th century got a mother civilization that explained the puzzling similarities between ancient cultures. The 20th century got crystal technology and psychic powers and warnings about nuclear destruction. And us, what do we get? Maybe we get the environmental reading, the civilization that destroyed itself by exploiting natural forces it didn't understand, the island that sank because its people took too much and gave back too little. There's something sharp about that interpretation right now as ice caps melt and seas rise. As weather patterns shift in ways that make farmers nervous, as scientists warn about tipping points and feedback loops and changes that can't be undone. We're not so different from the Atlanteans, maybe powerful beyond our wisdom, capable of reshaping the world, but not quite capable of knowing when to stop. The water is rising slowly for now, but rising. Or maybe we get the political reading, the democracy that devolved into something uglier, the republic that forgot its principles, the empire that expanded until it collapsed under its own weight. Every generation thinks it's living through unprecedented times. Every generation thinks the old order is crumbling. Sometimes they're right, usually they're wrong. The center holds more often than it feels like it will. But the worry is real. The sense that something precious is slipping away, that the institutions we relied on are weaker than we thought, that the virtues we assumed would persist might need active protection. Atlantis speaks to that worry, gives it shape, gives it precedent. Or maybe we get the psychological reading, the human tendency to reach for power beyond our wisdom, the gap between what we can do and what we should do, the endless cycle of rise and fall that seems built into our nature. All of these readings work. All of them connect to Plato's original. All of them matter. That's what makes a great story great. Not that it has one meaning, but that it has many meanings, enough to sustain conversation across millennia. The people who searched for literal Atlantis were missing the point. But they weren't wrong to search. The searching was its own kind of meaning-making, its own way of engaging with the story. Donnelly in his Minnesota farmhouse, surrounded by books, convinced he was on to something huge. Marinato's digging through volcanic ash, hoping to connect ancient catastrophe to ancient memory. Even the ancient aliens, people in their weird way trying to make sense of a world that often doesn't make sense. They all wanted the same thing to understand, to connect, to feel like the past matters, like it has something to tell us. That's not a bad impulse even, when it leads to bad conclusions. The world is confusing. History is confusing. We're all just making our best guesses using whatever tools Weber have. Some people's tools are better than others. Some guesses are more accurate. But the impulse to understand, or the drive to make meaning, that's universal. That's human. We're ABR, storytelling animal, the meaning-making animal. We can't help it. Even when there's no meaning there, we'll invent one. Even when the story doesn't fit, we'll force it. That's a bug and ABR feature both at once. It leads us into error, into conspiracy theories and BR pseudoscience and false patterns that feel true but aren't. It makes us vulnerable to manipulation by people who understand how stories work and are willing to exploit that understanding. But it also leads us into truth, into science and art and philosophy, into the kind of deep thinking that asks why things are the way they are. Into the connections between ideas that drive genuine understanding. The same impulse that created Donnie's nonsense also created Darwin's insight. The same drive to find patterns led one person to Atlantis and another to natural selection. We can't turn it off. We can only try to steer it, to check our pattern finding against evidence, to stay humble about our conclusions, to keep asking whether we're seeing what's there or what we want to be there. That's hard work, our lifelong work. And most of us don't do it well. But the trying matters, our Atlantis survives because we need it to. Not the literal island, the idea, the symbol, the story that contains all stories about civilizations and their fates. We'll keep telling it, keep adding to it, keep finding new versions that speak to new concerns. 100 years from now, people will still be talking about Atlantis. They'll have new theories, new evidence, new interpretations that we can't imagine. And they'll look back at us the way we look back at Donnelly, with a mixture of amusement and respect. They tried. Future people will say they didn't have all the answers, but they cared enough to ask the questions. That's not nothing. Your body is very heavy now. You've traveled a long way tonight, from ancient Athens to medieval monasteries, to Renaissance Florence, from Minnesota farmhouses to Virginia Beach seances to underwater archaeological sites. That's a lot of ground to cover, a lot of centuries, a lot of human yearning compressed into one evening. Let it settle now. Let it become part of your dreams. There's a theory, probably not scientific, but beautiful anyway, that dreams are how we process stories, that when we sleep, Our minds sort through the narratives we've encountered, finding patterns, making connections, storing what matters, and discarding what doesn't. If that's true, then Atlantis might visit you tonight, not as a place, as a feeling, a sense of something vast and lost and waiting. You don't have to solve it. You don't have to find it. You can just be with it. Let it wash over you like water. That's what stories do, in the end. They don't demand anything. They just offer themselves, and we take what we need. Plato is G. 1 has been gone for over 2,000 years. But his story keeps talking to us, keeps asking questions we haven't finished answering. Did Atlantis exist? We don't know. We probably never will. The evidence points to no, but evidence isn't everything. Some truths exist beyond evidence. Some stories are true even when they're not factual. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that Atlantis was real, not that we should keep searching, but that the search itself has value, that wondering is worthwhile, that mystery is a gift, not a problem to be solved. The ancient Greeks had a word for this, deimein. It's usually translated as wonder, but it means something more than that. It's the wonder that comes before understanding, the openness that makes learning possible. Plato said, "Philosophy begins in wonder." Aristotle said the same thing. Before you can know anything, you have to be amazed that there's anything to know. You have to stand in front of the universe and feel small and confused and hungry for answers. That feeling doesn't go away. When you learn things, it deepens. Every answer reveals new questions. Every solved mystery opens onto larger mysteries. The people who think they've figured it all out, they're the ones who've stopped wondering, stopped growing, stopped being fully alive to the strangeness of existence. Atlantis keeps wonder alive, even when you know it's probably not real, even when you've heard all the debunking and read all the critiques. There's still something, a shimmer of mystery. That doesn't quite go away. Maybe that's worth preserving. We live in a world that wants to quantify everything, measure everything, explain everything, and there's value in that. Science has given us longer lives and cleaner water and the ability to talk to each other across continents. But science can't tell us why any of it matters, can't explain what makes a life worth living, can't quantify the feeling of lying in the dark, listening to an old story, feeling connected to everyone who's ever heard it before. Some things resist measurement. Some truths can't be Googled. Atlantis is like that. A truth that lives in the searching, not the finding. The water is dark and quiet. Now, the temples are down there, maybe or maybe not. The golden walls have corroded to nothing or never existed at all. The orichalcum, whatever it was, has returned to the earth. But the story floats on the surface, light as a dream, ready to be picked up by whoever needs it next. You can pick it up too if you want. Carry it with you into sleep. Let it mix with whatever else is in there. Your hopes and fears and memories and random neurons firing in the dark. Atlantis has been doing this for a long time, mixing with human dreams, becoming part of our collective imagination. One more dreamer won't hurt. The ocean is patient. It's been waiting 9,000 years if you believe Plato, or 140 years if you date from Donnelly, or just since tonight since you started listening. Time gets funny. When you're falling asleep, centuries compress. Moments stretch. You're here and you're there and you're everywhere all at once. That's okay. That's how it's supposed to work. Plato is in the garden writing by lamplight. Donnelly is at his desk in Minnesota, snow falling outside. Marinatos is brushing ash from a fresco, seeing colors that haven't seen light in 3,000 years. Casey is in his trance, speaking about crystals and catastrophe. They're all with you now, all part of the same story, all asking the same question. What was lost? What might we find? What does it mean to search for something that may not exist? Don't have to answer. Some questions are just for holding, just for wondering about, just for carrying into sleep. The water rises gently, slowly, not like a catastrophe, like a tide coming in, like a blanket being pulled up. Let it cover the temples. Let it fill the canals. Let it smooth over the ruins until there's nothing left but dark water and silence. That's not destruction, that's rest. Even civilizations need to sleep sometimes. You're part of one, a civilization with its own temples and its own virtues and its own potential for corruption. You're living in the middle of a story that future generations will tell. Maybe they'll get it right. Maybe they'll understand us better than we understand ourselves. Or maybe they'll make up legends, turn us into myths. Wonder if we really existed. Or if we were just a story someone told to illustrate a point. Hey, their way, the story will continue. Stories always do. And you're part of it now. Part of the long chain of people who've wondered about Atlantis, who've lain in the dark and thought about lost civilizations and what they might mean. You're connected to Plato, to Donnelly, to everyone who's ever asked these questions. That connection doesn't require belief, doesn't require proof, just requires listening. And you've listened all the way to the end. Thank you for that. The story's over now, or this telling of it. Anyway, tomorrow there will be other tellings, other questions, other people lying in the dark wondering. But right now there's just this, the quiet, the dark, the slow drift towards sleep. Atlantis is down there in the deep water of your unconscious, in the place where stories go when we're not telling them. It'll be there when you wake up. Different, maybe filtered through whatever dreams you have tonight, but it'll be there. Some things don't sink completely. Some things float back up, no matter how deep they go. Atlantis is one of those things. So are you. Rest now. The search is over for tonight. Tomorrow, if you want, you can pick it up again, read more, wonder more, join the conversation that's been going on for 24 centuries, or not. It's okay. Either way, the mystery will wait. It's been waiting this long. It can wait a little longer. Good night. Sleep well. And if you dream of golden walls and crystal towers and water rising over everything, just let it happen. That's what dreams are for. All